Good evening, friends. Tonight, we find ourselves beneath the soft hush of a castle's outer walls, where ivy clings like memory and the scent of old stone lingers in the cool air. In this story, candles flicker in corridors left too long in silence, and a crown waits not in triumph, but in sorrow. You're about to enter the world of a kingdom on the edge, where power passes not through celebration, but through grief, and something far more complicated. And once you step inside, you might not find your way out so easily. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy the kind of slow, thoughtful stories we tell here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I always read them with care. Now then, dim the lights, maybe turn on a soft fan for a little background hum. Let's begin tonight's journey together. The king was dead, not from war, not from betrayal, but from a quiet illness that no physician could name. One day his voice grew hoarse, the next it faded to nothing. By the end of the week, the kingdom of Dareth mourned the passing of a man who had ruled with patience, gentleness, and a deep love for peace. In the candlelit corridors of the royal palace, a 17-year-old prince named Alaric stood alone, staring at the empty throne his father had occupied just days before. He did not cry, not because he wasn't grieving, but because something heavier than sadness had settled over his shoulders. Responsibility. At dawn, the royal council convened. A hurried coronation was declared as neighboring lords and distant cousins whispered among themselves about whether the boy was ready. But no one dared challenge the bloodline. Alaric was crowned king of Dareth within the week. The crown, wrought of river gold and lined with silk from the eastern coast, felt cold against his brow. The people rejoiced, but it was a quiet kind of joy, the kind rooted in tradition, not celebration. In the weeks that followed, Alaric made no grand changes. He walked the halls of his father's court, read every decree, listened carefully to his advisors. He refused to sign anything without reading it twice. But what surprised the court most wasn't his caution. It was who he listened to. Alaric held private meetings not only with dukes and scholars, but with farmers, sailors, tradesmen, and even traveling poets. He invited them to the palace gardens, asked questions that seemed too honest for a king. One evening, he spent an hour talking to a boy who swept the temple floors. "It is their world too," he once told his steward. "Why should I rule it without knowing how it feels beneath their feet?" Some nobles found this charming, others found it dangerous. One such noble was Lord Brenet of Ellestone, a man twice Alaric's age and 10 times as calculating. Brenet had expected the new king to be naive, perhaps pliable, but this quiet curiosity of Alaric's unsettled him. "He will listen his way into ruin," Brenet muttered over a goblet of honey wine. "Or worse, he'll start thinking for himself." It was not long before murmurs grew in the high halls of the nobility. The young king was too soft, too strange, too common. There were questions about where his loyalties lay. Some said he was being manipulated. Others whispered that the bloodline had thinned. Alaric knew. He heard the rumors, he watched the glances, he did not speak of it. But he began walking alone through the city's old quarter at night, hooded and unguarded. Just listening, observing. It was on one such evening that he wandered to the edge of the city, past the western gate, and into the wooded hills where the stars seemed sharper and the wind less tamed. There, nestled between 2 elder trees, was a lantern glowing low, and beside it, a man sat cross-legged in silence. His name was Cedric. He had once been a master of the royal archives, before vanishing from court 15 years earlier. Some said he had gone mad. Others said he had simply lost faith in the throne. Alaric didn't ask. He sat beside him, not as a king, as a student. And Cedric slowly began to speak, not in commands, but in questions. About history, about the weight of mercy, about how power doesn't only corrupt, but also reveals. For the first time since his coronation, Alaric didn't feel alone. The next morning, he returned to the palace with a silence that hummed like thunder beneath his robe. He summoned his council and began to issue new orders. Small ones, a tax reduction on grain for poor villages, funding for a scholars' guild, a law forbidding land seizure from widows without a court hearing. None were radical, but they were noticed, and with each one, Lord Brenade's lips thinned further. Behind closed doors, the old noble called upon allies, whispered warnings of instability, and quietly began to weave a plan. Not for war, not yet, but for containment. Because in Alaric they saw something dangerous, a king who listened, a king who learned, and worst of all, a king who might decide not to obey. Morning arrived in the palace of Dareth with the kind of hush that clung to stone. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as it moved past the high windows and through the silent halls lined with portraits of kings long buried. Alaric, now used to the weight of his velvet cloak and the cold ring of sovereignty around his brow, still rose early. He walked the eastern gardens alone. Not for ceremony, but for thought. The dew clung to the leaves like secrets. The sky was still unsure of its color, and beneath the gnarled limbs of the old elm tree, Alaric stood with hands behind his back, breathing in the damp scent of the earth. But his mind was not in the garden. It was in Elstone, where Lord Brennet, quiet and cunning, had called for a gathering of noble houses. Not an open rebellion, not yet, but a meeting of concerned peers, as the message said. A warning dressed as etiquette. The news had come to Alaric through Tomas, a loyal steward and one of the few from his boyhood still near him. Tomas had slipped the letter into Alaric's study late the night before, his expression tight. "They fear your softness," Tomas had said. "And worse, they fear what your kindness might cost them." Alaric had nodded, but said nothing. Now, in the stillness of morning, he replayed that sentence like a riddle. Was kindness something to be feared? Back in the throne room, the council gathered. Robes rich, faces unreadable. Alaric entered last, his steps slow and unflinching. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he studied each man and woman before him. Some he trusted. Most he tolerated. A few he knew would betray him if the wind turned just slightly. He took his seat on the throne, not slouched, not stiff, but balanced as if it were a perch rather than a pedestal. "I've heard of Elstone," he said plainly. "A meeting without the king. Curious." No one responded. He waited, and then, "Do we still believe in unity, or is it a word we write on banners and forget in banquet halls?" Still, silence. It was Lady Serena, one of the few council members who had supported his early reforms, who finally spoke. "They fear change, Your Majesty, not you." "They should," Alaric replied, almost softly. That night, he retired not to his chamber, but to the library, a vaulted, dust-scented labyrinth of tomes and scrolls. It was here that he found the comfort of thought and the ghosts of ideas long buried under swords and titles. Cedric's teachings echoed in his mind. The throne is not a shield, it is a mirror. Whatever you bring to it, it reflects tenfold. If that was true, Alaric wondered, what was he reflecting now? The following morning, he made a decision. He would go out again, beyond the gates, not as king, as a shadow among his people, not to spy or scheme, but to understand. He left the palace before dawn, cloaked in a plain wool garment, his hair tied back, no insignia. Tomas objected at first, but relented with a sigh and a hidden blade tucked beneath Alaric's sleeve. "I won't stop you," Tomas had said, "but I'll be waiting at the south gate by sunset. Don't make me come looking." Alaric smiled and disappeared into the crowd of the awakening city. The marketplace was already stirring when he arrived. Bakers opened shutters, blacksmiths stoked coals. Children dashed barefoot through alleyways with crusts of bread. Everything was loud, alive, and beautifully indifferent to power. No one recognized him. And for the first time since wearing the crown, Alaric felt human again. He bought a small tart from an old woman with bent fingers. She called him boy and shooed him along when he lingered. He listened to a street performer sing a song about a foolish prince and a clever goat. He laughed, and it wasn't forced. But not everything was light. In a narrow lane behind the tanner's square, he found a child, barefoot, covered in soot, coughing against the wall, no older than 10. When Alaric knelt beside him and offered the rest of his tart, the boy flinched. "Don't take me," the boy whispered, voice hoarse. "Take you where?" Alaric asked gently. The boy looked up, eyes wide. To the mines. They took my brother. He didn't come back. Alaric's jaw tightened. He knew of the mines, leased to the Lord of Dronwick in exchange for gold to fund the northern roads. He had signed the agreement himself, unaware of the laborers' age or fate. He had trusted the council's summaries, trusted that necessary hardship meant something different. He stood slowly, something cold blooming in his chest. By sunset, he returned to Thomas at the gate. He said nothing during the ride back to the palace. But the next morning, he summoned his scribes. New edicts were drafted. One banned the use of child labor in all kingdom holdings. Another required monthly inspections of any royal chartered industry. A third revoked Dronwick's lease entirely. When Brennet received word of the changes, he sent a messenger. The note was short. "You act swiftly, your majesty, but not wisely." Alaric burned it without reply. In private, he returned once more to Cedric's grove. The old hermit sat just where he had the last time, beneath the same elder tree, watching the sky turn orange with dusk. "You're changing," Cedric said without looking up. "Is that a warning?" "A hope," Cedric replied. "But I've seen hope turn to fire before." Alaric sat beside him. "I saw a child today," he said. "Afraid I'd take him to a mine." Cedric said nothing. "I gave that order," Alaric confessed, "without knowing." Cedric finally turned. "Then now you know, and knowing is the weight." They sat in silence after that. And as the stars blinked awake overhead, the boy king stared into the dark trees and whispered, not to Cedric, but to himself. "If the crown reflects what I am, I must become something worth reflecting." He did not yet realize that the mirror he feared most was not the throne. It was the eyes of his people. The days that followed Alaric's quiet return from the city were filled with movement. Not the kind that stirred trumpets or filled the streets with parades, but subtle systemic change. The kind that made scribes lose sleep and nobles feel their control slipping grain by grain through their jeweled fingers. The edicts were signed, sealed, and posted in every town square. Markets paused, clerks blinked, guildmasters whispered behind closed shutters. It wasn't just that laws had changed, it was who they protected now. And far from the palace, in villages tucked into forests and built along slow rivers, parents whispered thanks. Mothers cried quietly behind their doors. Fathers stood straighter at the news that their children would not disappear into mines before they reached manhood. For a brief moment, it felt like someone at the top had remembered those at the bottom. But power does not retreat quietly. In the council chambers, a storm brewed beneath the surface. Lord Brennet did not shout, he did not slam his fist, he smiled. "Very noble," he said during the next council meeting, his tone smooth as oil. "And very dangerous." Alaric met his gaze. Dangerous to whom? To order, to efficiency, to the balance that keeps this kingdom standing. Alaric's voice stayed calm. "I'd rather the kingdom stand on justice than on the backs of starving children." There was silence. Then, a few polite coughs, averted eyes, one or two nods from younger lords who hadn't yet learned how to hide their approval. Brennet's lips curled slightly. "Your Majesty, perhaps you would benefit from rest or perspective." Alaric leaned forward, hands folded. "Then let me offer some." "I walked your balance, Lord Brennet. It's paved with grief." No one spoke after that. The meeting ended early. That evening, Brennet hosted a private dinner in his manor near the palace. Only select nobles were invited, those who had expressed concerns about the king's direction. Over rare wines and game meat, they voiced their grievances more freely. "He's undoing decades of control," said one. "He listens to peasants," muttered another, "to poets and hermits." "He'll tear the crown from its roots." Brennet only nodded. He didn't suggest rebellion. He didn't need to. The seed had already been planted. Meanwhile, Alaric sought Cedric again. This time, he brought food. Bread, cheese, a flask of clean water. They sat beneath the stars as they often did now. "You look tired," Cedric observed. "I am," Alaric admitted. "Because of the council?" "No," Alaric said. "Because of the silence." Cedric raised an eyebrow. "They don't argue with me anymore," Alaric explained. "They wait, they watch. I can feel them planning something, but I don't know what." Cedric nodded slowly. "They are no longer challenging your voice. They are preparing to remove it." Alaric said nothing for a moment. Then I thought reform would bring peace. It brings friction first, Cedric said. Always. Fire needs to burn through rot before it warms the hearth. Alaric glanced up. And if I become the fire? Cedric met his eyes. Then beware who you scorch. The next morning, Alaric took a risk. He issued a royal invitation, not to lords, but to citizens. He declared that once a week, the palace gates would open to any who wished to speak before the throne. No permission required, no title necessary. The first day, only a few came. By the second week, there were hundreds. The stories poured in of unjust taxes, of corrupt bailiffs, of stolen lands, and false charges. Alaric listened to everyone. Some he dismissed gently, others he pursued with quiet rage. One elderly woman described how her family had been evicted from land they'd tended for generations by a noble under Brunette's patronage. Alaric ordered an investigation the same day. Within a week, the land was restored, the noble stripped of title. That night, torches flared beyond the palace walls, not in celebration, in mourning. A message was delivered by anonymous courier. A single word, enough. Tomas found it on the floor outside Alaric's chambers. His face was pale when he showed it to the king. We should tighten security, Tomas said. Double the watch. Alaric shook his head. No, that's what they want, for me to fear them. Tomas's voice dropped. Maybe you should, but Alaric remained firm. Power built on fear only protects itself. I won't become them just to stop them. Yet that night, as he tried to sleep, Alaric realized something unsettling. He didn't know who they were anymore. Not fully, not clearly. They had become smoke, without names, without open threat, and more dangerous because of it. And so quietly, he made his own move. He approached Captain Reeve, commander of the palace guard, and assigned him a secret task: to assemble a unit loyal only to the throne, trained in discretion, deployed without fanfare. They would be watchers, protectors, shadows. He called them the White Veil. Their purpose wasn't to spy, it was to shield, to know what the king could not see. The irony wasn't lost on Alaric. He had wanted to rule with openness, and now he was creating something hidden. Cedric would disapprove. But Cedric wasn't in the council room or the torchlit alleyways where whispers grew like weeds. Alaric didn't like this part of ruling, but he understood now. It was part of the path. By the end of the week, the White Veil had quietly identified 3 nobles, actively coordinating correspondence with foreign powers. The letters were vague, but the tone was clear. Promises, preparations, offers of support should change, arrive in Dareth. Alaric read each one by candlelight. His expression never changed. He issued no arrests, not yet. But he remembered the names. At the next council session, Alaric arrived early. He stood beside the throne rather than sitting on it, and when the chamber filled, he looked at each person in silence. Loyalty, he said, is not a favor to a king, it is a promise to a kingdom. He let the words hang in the air like blades. Then he sat, and for the first time, the council didn't speak. They listened, because something in Alaric had shifted. Not in anger, not in pride, but in depth. He was no longer the boy they hoped to shape. He was becoming something else, something harder, something steady. And in the stillness of that room, power changed hands without a single word more spoken. The wind carried whispers now. In the courtyards of Dareth, behind pillars draped with ivy, within the quiet corners of bathhouses and candlelit inns, people spoke of the young king who sat tall and silent, of his reforms, his poise, and of the invisible web he had begun to weave across the kingdom. Some called him bold, some called him dangerous, but no one called him a child anymore. Alaric spent less time in ceremony, more time in study. His evenings were consumed with letters from the far reaches of the realm, reports from grain harvests, trade disputes, and petitions from mountain villages so remote they hadn't seen a royal envoy in decades. He read everything. He responded to most. Tomas, ever at his side, grew increasingly concerned with the king's pace. "You sleep 3 hours a night," he said one morning as Alaric pored over a parchment. Alaric replied without looking up, "Then I'll work twice as fast while I'm awake." "That isn't a crown on your head anymore," Tomas muttered. "It's a fire." Alaric glanced at him. "Then let it burn the rot." But behind closed doors, the rot had already begun to move. Lord Brennet had grown quieter since the council meeting. Not absent, not confrontational, just quiet. Too quiet. In the grand chambers of his estate, Brennet convened with a smaller, tighter circle, men and women bound less by title and more by fear. They spoke not of politics, but of pressure points, not of governance, but of control. "We can't remove him by force," one whispered. "Not yet." "No," Brennet agreed, "but we can remove his reach." Their plan was not to topple the throne. It was to strangle it, one arm at a time. The first blow came in the form of a failed grain shipment, then a delay in funding for the Scholars Guild, then a revolt, small but loud, in a port town where rumors had been planted about royal guards seizing fishing boats. Each disruption was minor on paper, but together they created the illusion of chaos. And chaos in the hands of the powerful is always a useful tool. Alaric didn't panic. He listened, he studied, and then he struck. He dispatched members of the White Veil, now trained, silent, and trusted, to investigate each event, not as soldiers, but as truth seekers. Within days, they returned. The grain had been purchased by Brennet's cousin and rerouted to black market sellers. The guild delay was orchestrated by a scribe in debt to Elstone's treasury. The rumors in the port town traced back to a paid minstrel spreading false songs. Alaric said nothing publicly, but the next council meeting was different. He walked in alone. No guard, no announcement, just presence. He placed a stack of documents on the table in front of him, then looked directly at Lord Brennet. "I have proof," he said, voice steady, "but I seek clarity, not punishment." Brennet raised an eyebrow. "Proof of what?" "Sabotage," Alaric replied, "from within this council." The room shifted. "No names," Alaric continued. "Not yet, but I offer this. Anyone who steps forward now, truthfully, will be heard, not hunted." Silence. Not a soul moved. Alaric nodded once. "Then the window closes," he said, and walked out. That evening he met Cedric at the grove, where the old hermit had been waiting, seated on the root of the elder tree, as if he had always known Alaric would return that night. "You've started hunting shadows," Cedric said without turning. "I'm trying to reveal them," Alaric replied. "Same thing," Cedric said, "just sounds kinder." Alaric sat, exhaling. "I tried giving them a way out. No one took it. Because they think they can still win." Alaric looked up at the stars. "And if they do?" Cedric turned to him for the first time. "Then you'll have learned that justice without strength is only suggestion." They sat in silence again, the night air cool against their skin. Back at the palace, Alaric began restructuring his command quietly. He divided responsibilities between those loyal not to him personally, but to principles: fairness, dignity, clarity. The White Veil expanded, not in number, but in reach. They didn't threaten. They didn't coerce. They simply watched, and the nobles began to notice. One morning, a sealed letter arrived in Alaric's study. No crest, no signature. It contained a single sentence: "If you do not yield, we will choose a king who will." Tomas read it twice. "Do we trace it?" "No," Alaric said. "Do we respond?" He folded the letter. "We prepare." He called for Captain Reeve. "I want increased patrols near the northern gates," Alaric ordered. "Double them at night." "Expecting an attack?" Reeve asked. "No," Alaric replied. "Expecting a test." Because Alaric understood now, his enemies would not declare war. They would whisper it into existence. And so he gave his people something louder: hope. He announced a new education decree. Every village in Dareth would receive funding to train one local teacher, chosen by the people. A palace-funded library would be built in every provincial capital. He toured the countryside, not as ruler, but as guest, eating the bread he was offered, listening, remembering names. The people responded not with cheers, but with trust. They began to send him letters, thousands of them, handwritten, clumsy, heartfelt letters. Alaric read them all, and one night, after a long day in the outer provinces, he returned to find a child waiting at the palace gates. She held a folded piece of parchment in both hands. It read, "Dear King, my brother says you're not scared of lords. That makes you brave. I want to be brave too." Alaric knelt and looked her in the eyes. "You already are," he said. As the guards opened the gates behind him, he looked up at the sky, now dark but clear. War had not come yet, but he could feel it breathing. And if it came, he would meet it, not as a boy on a throne, but as a man who had walked the road, listened to his people, and chosen to carry their voice like a banner in the storm. He was not finished, not even close. The frost arrived earlier than usual that year. Thin layers of ice formed along the palace fountains, and the morning grass crunched underfoot as Alaric stepped out into the courtyard, wrapped in a thick wool cloak. The cold bit at his fingers, but he welcomed it. It cleared the mind, stripped away pretense. Winter, like power, had a way of showing people who they truly were. Inside the palace, preparations for the annual solstice gathering were underway. It was tradition, a night of fire and feasting, of lanterns floating in the river, and nobles draped in silks they only wore once. But this year, Alaric had made a change. The celebration would be held not within the gilded halls of Dareth, but in the city square, open to all, from scholars to stonemasons. There would be no velvet curtains, no servants pouring wine into crystal, just fires, music, bread, and a king among his people. Many nobles were displeased. Lord Brené had been the most vocal, though still careful to speak only in private. "A ruler must remain above," he had said softly. "When you sit beside the butcher, your majesty, you lower the throne." Alaric had responded with a smile. "Or perhaps I raise the butcher." The day of the solstice arrived, with a gray sky and snow flurries drifting like ash. By late afternoon, thousands had gathered in the square, wrapped in cloaks and shawls, faces lit by the orange glow of fire pits. Children ran laughing between rows of bread stalls. Musicians played old songs on fiddles and flutes, and people sang, some in tune, most not. Alaric stood at the center of it all, no crown, no guards at his side. Just Tomas, leaning on a walking stick and muttering about how he hated the cold. "You could have picked a festival in the summer," Tomas grumbled. Alaric grinned. "Then it wouldn't feel like survival." He spent the evening walking, talking, listening. He shared soup with a blacksmith who spoke of rising iron costs. He danced, badly, with an old woman who claimed she'd taught his father how to waltz. He held a newborn while the mother wiped her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Not once did anyone kneel. They greeted him as a man, not a monarch. And for a brief, flickering moment, Dareth felt like something more than a kingdom. It felt like a family. But not far away, in the flickering candlelight of Elstone, others watched the scene with cold detachment. "Look at them," said Lord Halvin, peering out the window with a goblet in hand. "They cheer for bread and fire like dogs." "They cheer because they believe," Brenet replied, seated at the head of the table. "Believe in what?" Halvin scoffed. "In him." Silence followed. Then Lady Maria spoke, her voice like silk on glass. "He's dangerous, Lionel. More dangerous than your father ever was." Brennett's eyes narrowed. "Yes," he said, "because unlike his father, he believes he's right." They didn't toast. They made plans. The following week, Alaric returned to the palace with renewed purpose. He ordered the treasury to allocate additional grain stores to the southern provinces where snowstorms had closed off trade routes. He met with the Healers Guild to draft a system of traveling medics, and he began building a new school, one meant not for nobles, but for anyone who could read and write, regardless of blood. But as he expanded his reach, resistance grew. The White Veil brought news of unrest, not among commoners, but within the military ranks. Several captains had begun questioning the king's focus on books over blades. Supplies to garrisons were being delayed. A training camp near the northern border had refused new recruits unless directly ordered. Alaric summoned Captain Reeve. "Do we have command?" he asked. Reeve hesitated. "We have loyalty," he said, "but not unity. Some still serve old loyalties." "Then bring me the list," Alaric said. "Names. I want to speak to them myself." Reeve's eyes widened. "You'll speak to them directly?" "Yes. But if they're plotting, then I'd rather hear it in their own words." Within days, 12 captains arrived at the palace. They expected a tribunal. They were brought to the dining hall. Alaric sat at the table, unarmed, with fresh bread, stew, and wine already served. He gestured for them to sit. "I won't accuse you," he said calmly. "I'll ask you." There was silence. Then one of them, a gray-bearded man named Corvin, finally spoke. "You rule like a poet," he said, "and we are soldiers." Alaric nodded. And what does a soldier need? Order, clarity, strength. I've offered all three, Alaric said. You mistake compassion for weakness. Corvin leaned forward. And what if we need a king who strikes first? Alaric met his gaze. Then you'll need a different king. The room went still. Not in anger, in understanding. No one rose. No one stormed out. Instead, one by one, they lowered their eyes, not in submission, but in thought. By the end of the meal, Alaric had gained something more valuable than obedience. He had earned respect, but not all battles were won with words. The next morning, a fire erupted in the archives. Scrolls dating back 2 centuries were lost. Maps, treaties, genealogies, all turned to ash. It wasn't an accident. The White Veil found the mark of a rebel faction, an old symbol not seen in Dareth for over 30 years, a flame wrapped in thorns. Alaric stood before the blackened stones of the archive tower, hands clenched at his sides. Cedric arrived quietly, walking stick tapping the scorched floor. They want you angry, he said. I'm not angry, Alaric replied. Then you're not paying attention. Then you're not paying attention. They want to erase history. They want to write their own. And what would you have me do? Cedric looked at the rubble. Build again. Not from memory, from conviction. That night, Alaric issued a royal decree. A new archive would be built, not behind walls, but in the city center, open to all, protected by the people. And alongside it, a flame-shaped sculpture made from the charred stones of the old archive, engraved with a single phrase, "We remember." It wasn't revenge. It was defiance, a quiet, enduring kind. And somewhere deep in the north, where messages moved by moonlight and men trained in silence, a voice read the decree and whispered, "He won't break." The answer came like steel. Then he must bend. Snow fell in steady silence, blanketing Dareth in a hush that felt almost sacred. The palace rooftops disappeared beneath white weight, the gardens grew still and monochrome, and even the busy markets slowed into quiet exchanges under thick woolen cloaks. But inside the halls of power, silence did not mean stillness. Alaric stood before a map of the realm, ink trails tracing roads, rivers, and rebellion. A new pattern was beginning to take shape. Not one of invasion from beyond, but of coordinated unrest from within. The White Veil had intercepted encrypted letters, small notes sewn into hems, pressed into wax seals, hidden in the folds of song lyrics. All of them pointed to the same truth. There was no single enemy. There was a network, scattered, cautious, but growing bolder. Lord Brené, though still attending council sessions with the same practiced calm, had not once addressed the recent archive fire. He neither condemned nor condoned. That silence was louder than any denial. And so Alaric made a decision. He would go to the south, not as king, but as listener. He rode with a small escort, refusing the royal caravan, dressed in a simple coat with no crest. Beside him rode Thomas and 2 members of the White Veil, both dressed like ordinary guardsmen. They stopped in villages buried in snow. They slept in inns with sagging beams. And in each place, Alaric asked questions. He spoke to farmers who'd lost their seed to theft, to merchants who feared bandits more than taxes, to children who pointed at soldiers and asked, "Are they ours or theirs?" In one village near the southern ridge, a woman named Mela offered them shelter. She was sharp-tongued and quick-eyed, with hands that showed years of wood chopping and wounds that had healed poorly. "Too many strangers passing through," she said, ladling stew into wooden bowls. "Too many with coin, and too many who won't say where they're from." "Have they harmed anyone?" Alaric asked. "Not yet," Mela said, "but they whisper too low, and they watch too much." Later that night, after the others had fallen asleep, she pulled Alaric aside. "I've seen kings come and go," she said. "You talk different," he met her gaze, "because I was raised by someone who did." Mela studied him. "If you mean to protect us, do it loud. We've had enough quiet." Back in the capital, the palace had changed, not in structure, but in spirit. The servants moved more carefully. The scribes spoke in shorter sentences. Even Captain Reeve kept a hand near his sword more often than not. The sense of siege was invisible but palpable. When Alaric returned, the first thing he noticed was the smell, burning oil. Tomas met him at the gates. 2 more supply wagons hijacked. Anyone hurt? No, but the soldiers didn't resist. They let the wagons go. Out of fear? Out of confusion, Tomas said. No orders, no clarity, just tension. Alaric summoned his commanders the next morning. He stood at the head of the war chamber, a place rarely used since his father's reign. Maps were pinned to walls and a hearth burned low at the back of the room. I will not start a war against my own people, Alaric began, but I will not let them be taken from within. He outlined his strategy, not one of force, but of presence. Troops would be stationed visibly, not to attack, but to reassure. Food stores would be protected, roads patrolled, and in every major town, a representative of the crown would be installed, not a noble, but a citizen chosen by the people to speak for them. This isn't about showing strength, Alaric said. It's about showing up. One commander asked the question no one wanted to say aloud. And if we are struck, then we endure, Alaric replied, and we hold the line. In the weeks that followed, the kingdom held its breath. The uprisings didn't stop, but they changed. There were fewer attacks, but more provocations. Firebrands giving speeches in town squares, anonymous letters nailed to church doors, paintings of the king with thorns across his brow scrawled in soot. Alaric didn't order arrests. Instead, he ordered mirrors. He told every town to erect a polished bronze mirror in its square with a simple inscription, "Ask what you would do if you sat on the throne." Some scoffed, others paused, but one by one, people began to speak differently, not softer, but smarter. They argued policy, not personality. They debated fairness, not just fear. And in that shift, Alaric saw a fragile kind of victory. Then came the fire in Elstone, not a market fire, not an accident, a targeted blaze set at the granary, enough to destroy 3 months' worth of stored food, enough to cause panic, enough to kill. 10 dead, 50 more displaced. It was the worst attack yet. Alaric stood in the ashes 2 days later, cloak wet with soot. Families stood around him, not angry but hollow. He said nothing. There were no words to give back grain or life. But when he returned to the palace, he didn't sit down. He called for the scribes. He drafted letters, not edicts, personal letters, one for each family. He wrote through the night, hand aching, refusing help. Tomas found him at dawn, eyes rimmed red. "You can't shoulder every wound," Tomas said gently. "I already do," Alaric replied, "and if you fall under it, then I wasn't strong enough to lead." The next council meeting was different. Alaric entered without ceremony. He looked each lord in the eye. "I know some of you still plot against me," he said calmly. "I know some of you believe I cannot protect this kingdom." No one responded. "Then I invite you," he continued, "to take up the burden yourselves, to step into the fire, speak with the people, and return to tell me what you see." Lord Brenet's expression did not change, but his hands folded before him tightened. "I rule not because I wish to," Alaric finished, "but because I must. If any of you wish to carry this weight, step forward." Silence. Then Lady Carith, youngest of the nobles, stood slowly. "I don't wish to carry it," she said, "but I will stand beside it." One by one, others followed. Not all, but enough. And Lord Brenet? He remained seated, watching, waiting. But for the first time, he looked less like a puppeteer and more like a man watching his strings fray. Alaric left the chamber with no words of triumph, only one thought burning. The kingdom is still bleeding, but so long as he stood, it would not bleed alone. The thaw came late. Winter clung to the hills and valleys of Dareth like a jealous ghost, refusing to yield its grip. When spring finally pushed its way through the frost, it did so not with flowers, but with mud, wet roads, swollen rivers, and a wariness in the people that even warm sun could not quickly undo. But Alaric did not wait for perfect weather. He had learned that peace was not a season, it was a choice, one that had to be made again and again, especially when the world felt uncertain. The new grain caravans began their journey south from the capital, each guarded by both soldiers and volunteer townsfolk. Alaric's plan was simple: protect the people with the people. Rebuild trust by rebuilding together. And at first, it worked. The first 3 caravans reached their destinations without incident. The 4th, however, never arrived. 2 weeks passed with no word. Then a rider returned, bloodied but alive, of carrying a torn scrap of fabric bearing the same flame and thorn sigil seen at the archive fire. The message was clear. The enemies of the crown were no longer hiding, they were acting. Alaric stood before the gathered captains in the palace war chamber, the scrap laid flat on the table before them. "This is not a rebellion," he said. "It is a campaign, and we must treat it as such." Captain Reeve leaned forward. "Should we strike first?" "No," Alaric replied. "We strike precisely," he pointed to the map. "They are coordinated, that means communication, and communication leaves trails." The White Veil was activated in full. Over the next week, they tracked whispers like wolves, in taverns, along back roads, through coin and ink and silence. They found a network, smaller than feared, but clever. The rebel group called itself the Ember Pact, a name meant to invoke destruction and renewal. They operated in clusters of 3 to 5, never staying in one place more than 2 nights. Their leaders rarely met. They used coded language built on old poetry and market slang. But the most dangerous thing about them wasn't their cunning, it was their belief. These were not mercenaries. They were former scholars, displaced farmers, even ex-soldiers, all who believed the crown had become too soft, too thoughtful, too modern. "We were kings once," one captured rebel whispered. "Now we're librarians with swords." Alaric read the reports in silence. Then he made a choice that surprised even Tomas. He would meet with one of them, not in chains, in conversation. They brought the prisoner to a stone chamber deep beneath the palace, lit by a single oil lamp. No guards, no weapons, just Alaric and a man named Darren, 30, sharp-eyed and still wearing the bruises from his capture. "Why am I alive?" Darren asked as soon as he was seated. "Because I need to understand," Alaric said. Darren laughed. "You think this is a misunderstanding? I think every war begins with one. Then you've never seen a real war." Alaric met his gaze. "I've seen enough to want to stop another." There was silence. Then Darren leaned forward. "You think you're better than your father, but you're doing the same thing he did. And what's that? Building a kingdom in your own image." Alaric didn't flinch. "Would you rather I built it in yours?" "No," Darren said, eyes steady. "I'd rather we built it together." Alaric paused. "You burned the archives. We burned lies," Darren snapped. "You killed farmers. We targeted supplies, not people. But people died." Darren looked away. That silence was all Alaric needed. He stood. "I don't need you to agree with me," he said, "but I need you to understand this kingdom isn't mine. It's everyone's, even yours. If you want to build something, start by not burning it down." He left Darren in silence, but he left with something too, a realization. His enemy wasn't a monster, it was a man. That night, Alaric stood on the palace balcony, watching the lanterns of the city flicker like stars that had fallen too far from the sky. Cedric joined him, silent for a time. Finally, he said, "You met him." Alaric nodded. "And? He's angry, intelligent, wrong, and right." Cedric smiled faintly. "Then he's human." "I thought clarity would bring peace," Alaric said. "It never does," Cedric replied. "It brings choice." Alaric turned to him. "And what if the people choose him over me?" Cedric looked at the stars. "Then you've done your job." Alaric didn't answer. He watched the sky instead. The next morning, he made another bold decision. He ordered an open forum. Any citizen, any background, could stand in the great square and speak about their hopes, their fears, their king, even their rebellion. No guards would interfere unless violence broke out. The nobles were horrified. Tomas was speechless. But Alaric was resolute. And so, for the first time in the kingdom's history, the crown listened without defense. People spoke. Some praised the reforms. Some mourned what they felt had been lost. One woman, an elder from the north, said simply, "We needed your ears before we needed your laws." Alaric stood in the shadows, unseen, and listened to every word. And when the final speaker stepped down, the crowd didn't cheer. They didn't shout. They just stayed. Silent, present, hopeful. That night, Alaric wrote a single sentence in his journal. "The people do not want a hero. They want to be heard." And for the first time in weeks, he slept without dreams. The morning after the forum, the palace corridors buzzed, not with gossip, but with wonder. No riots, no uprisings, just words. It was as if the entire kingdom had exhaled at once after holding its breath for too long. Even the skeptical nobles were subdued. Some whispered that Alaric had taken a reckless gamble. Others, though silent, began to see something shift in the air, an authority rooted not in fear, but in presence. The throne had not cracked, it had expanded, but not everyone was satisfied. Far beyond Dareth's eastern ridge in the worn-down stronghold of Varnwick, Lord Brennet gathered with his most loyal allies. The Ember Pact had retreated into the shadows again, but the flame of discontent still smoldered. "He listens too much," one baron muttered. "A king must command." "No," Brennet said slowly, "a king must convince." He sipped his wine and turned to a parchment laid before him, a carefully inked family tree of noble bloodlines. "Do you know the strength of blood, gentlemen?" he asked, tapping a name near the top. "It is more binding than banners, more enduring than law." He circled a name at the bottom, Elias Thorne, a cousin, a claimant, a shadow waiting to be shaped. Back in the capital, Alaric continued his rounds. He toured the half-built schoolhouse near the river district, where children ran through the scaffolding like it was a castle under siege. He spent hours with city masons finalizing plans for the public archive, insisting it include a chamber for oral histories, stories spoken, not written, because not every voice had ink. He broke bread with weavers, scribes, and blacksmiths. He listened to apprentices and elders alike, but he also watched the horizon. Something in the wind had changed. At the council, Thomas brought news that confirmed it. Brennet had not returned from his estates in over 3 weeks. He'd withdrawn funds from his personal guard, transferred property titles in the northern counties, and requested weapons from Varnwick's forges. "He's not waiting anymore," Thomas said. "No," Alaric murmured. "He's preparing." "Will you strike first?" Alaric shook his head. "I'll call him home." It was not an order. The royal summons was sent with ceremony, a sealed parchment bound with the king's sigil, hand-delivered by Alaric's personal envoy. It was not an order, but a request, an invitation to speak face-to-face beneath the banners of peace. The reply came back 4 days later. A single sentence: "When you remember what the crown means, I will return." Alaric read it twice. Then he handed it to Cedric. "What would you do?" Cedric looked at the words. "I would not ask again." That evening, Alaric walked the length of the royal gallery alone. Portraits of kings long dead watched from every wall, some stern, some smiling, all draped in oil and legacy. At the very end of the hall hung his father's likeness, tall, cloaked in red, eyes cold. Alaric stared at it for a long time. Then, without a word, he pulled the canvas down. He did not burn it. He had it moved to the new public archive. Let the people decide what kind of king he had been. Let them write the truth. 2 weeks later, a quiet storm broke the city. Not wind, not snow, but rumors. Brennet had raised a banner, a new one, not the sigil of his house, but a golden crown encircled by thorns, a symbol meant to wound. He did not declare war, he declared legitimacy. In Varnwick and 2 surrounding regions, lords aligned with Brennet began holding separate court sessions. Coin minted without the king's face began to circulate. Decrees were issued, signed not by Alaric but by Elias Thorne, the cousin, a name few remembered, but one the old houses now repeated like a forgotten hymn. Thomas slammed his fist on the council table. "This is sedition." "It's theater," Reeve muttered. "But the kind that sells tickets." Alaric raised a hand. "This is exactly what I feared. They won't fight me directly. They'll split the kingdom with words." "Here," Cedric leaned forward. "Then what do you do, Your Majesty?" Alaric stood. "I speak louder." The very next morning, a citywide proclamation was issued, a gathering, not for nobles, not for council, for the people, held in the largest arena Dareth had ever built, meant for races, now repurposed for voices. Every town and region was invited to send 10 citizens, chosen freely, craftsmen, elders, farmers, healers, anyone, not to swear loyalty, but to speak, to shape the realm's next steps, and to decide what the crown meant now. It was called the Convocation. It was dangerous, but it was undeniable. Within days, the roads into Dareth swelled. Caravans arrived bearing banners not of families but of towns. People brought bread, not swords, hope, not oaths. And when the arena filled, stone seats packed, air thick with tension and anticipation, Alaric did not arrive on a throne. He stood on the ground, among them, a simple wooden platform. No crown, just words. He waited until silence came, then he spoke. I am not here to demand your loyalty. I am here to earn your voice. He walked slowly, meeting eyes. They say a king must be above his people. I say a king must be among them. Murmurs. But there is another voice now, one that claims power can return to bloodlines and banners, that thrones can be stolen, not earned, that old names matter more than new lives. He paused. I disagree. Silence again. I was not born to rule, I was born to serve. If I fail at that, remove me. But if you believe there is more to build, then help me build it. And then he stepped down, not finished, just done. One by one, voices rose, some loud, some shaking, some furious, some weeping, but none ignored. The convocation had begun, not a ceremony, a reckoning, a kingdom redefining itself in real time. And far away in Varnwick, Brenet received word of what was happening. He laughed. Then, for the first time in years, he put on armor. The convocation rippled through the kingdom like a stone tossed into still water. Word of it spread faster than proclamations ever could, by breath, by carriage, by whispers at firesides. Farmers carried stories back to their villages. Blacksmiths recited speeches as they hammered out steel. Children reenacted Alaric's platform speech, their voices echoing off fences and alleyways. And yet, for all its hope, not everyone welcomed this tide of change. In the high towers of Varnwick, Lord Brenet read report after report with growing unease. What he had counted on, division, fear, nostalgia, was slowly being undone by participation. Where he had expected hesitation, he found voices. And where he had hoped for silence, he found stories. Elias Thorne stood behind him, draped in the royal colors that once belonged to his grandfather's failed claim. The young man was well-educated, articulate, and most importantly, malleable. They're building a republic in all but name, Brenet muttered, setting the latest scroll aside. Elias cleared his throat. Then we offer a crown, one with less talk, more order. Brenet turned to the window, staring out over the misty valleys below. Order means nothing without consent, he said. But fear can mimic it for a time. He tapped his fingers on the cold stone sill. Prepare the envoy, he said. We ride to the western border. Back in Dareth, the convocation entered its third day. What began as a symbolic gesture had grown into a true council. Farmers debated with scholars, veterans challenged merchants. A young baker named Leanne proposed a new grain-sharing program that drew applause from all sides. Alaric listened more than he spoke. He took notes, walked among the people between sessions, and spent his nights in the library reviewing past reforms and forgotten precedents. The white veil, once used for shadows, now helped him understand sentiment, gathering complaints, praise, patterns of fear, and hope alike. Cedric, watching from a distance, smiled quietly. You're becoming dangerous, he said one evening. Alaric looked up from his desk. How so? You're turning empathy into policy. Then came the envoy from the west, clad in silver and scarlet, bearing no sword, but a sealed letter from Lord Brenet, addressed to the king or his successor. The arena stilled as the message was read aloud by the royal herald. Its contents were simple, sharp, and venom-laced. Brenet did not recognize the convocation. He accused Alaric of surrendering the sovereignty of the crown to popular whim. He demanded that the king disband the gathering within 7 days, restore noble authority, and submit all reforms to a high court of peers, led naturally by Brenet himself. If not, the Western Territories would declare autonomous rule under Elias Thorne, styled as protector of the realm. The arena erupted in a storm of voices. Some cried treason, others cried warning, and a few cried for compromise. Alaric raised a hand, and the sound fell like snow. He stepped forward, took the letter, and, without theatrics, tore it clean in two. Then he looked up. No one who makes demands while wearing borrowed titles deserves the voice of this kingdom. There was no applause, just silence. Tight, focused, resolved, resolved. That night, met with his inner circle, Tomas paced the room, jaw tight. This is war. We must treat it as such. Captain Reeve nodded. Their forces are smaller, but trained, and they know the terrain. Cedric folded his hands. You can't reason with men who see words as weakness. Alaric listened, then spoke. If we attack, we prove them right that we are only a crown of control. And if we don't, Tomas asked, they'll take territory, people, resources. Alaric stood. Then we hold, not with fire, with truth. He sent letters, not legions, to every village in the west, bypassing the lords. He explained the convocation, detailed reforms, addressed fears with clarity, not rhetoric. He asked for dialogue. He offered visits from neutral observers. And slowly, quietly, some villages responded. Not with allegiance, but with questions. That was enough. The attack was swift and bloodless, but Brenna had his own plans. 3 days later, under cover of fog, his forces seized the town of Greystone, a key southern crossing point with grain reserves and a major courier station. The attack was swift and bloodless, but symbolic. Elias Thorne, flanked by loyal bannermen, stood in the town square and declared the restoration of noble order. He offered pardons to any soldiers of Alaric's crown who swore fealty to the new protectorate. Some did, many did not. And when news reached Dareth, it struck not like thunder, but like an old wound reopened. Tomas slammed a dagger into the map table. Now, Alaric, calm, met his eyes. Now we act. But he did not ride with an army. He rode with 50 emissaries, speakers, clerks, and guards. Not a war band, but a witness band. Alaric approached Greystone not with siege towers, but with documents, with his royal seal, with records from the convocation, lists of petitions, names of those forgotten under noble reign. He requested a meeting with the town elders, and they granted it. For 5 hours, he listened to complaints, to confusion, to fear. And then he asked only one question. Who protects you better, those who command from towers, or those who stand among you? No answer came at once, but the next day the town gates opened. Greystone was returned to the crown. Elias Thorne had vanished in the night. Lord Brennet, furious, issued a proclamation denouncing the town as misled and temporarily seduced. But the damage had been done, not in war, in witness. When Alaric returned to Dareth, the convocation rose to greet him. They had written a charter, not a constitution, but a promise that no decree would pass without representation, that no crown would rise without listening, and that no man, no matter his name, would speak louder than the voice of the people. Alaric read it aloud in the arena. Then he signed it, not in royal ink, but in charcoal, burned from the wood of the platform he had first stood on. It was fragile, it was incomplete, but it was real. And that night, as the kingdom watched stars emerge over a sky less heavy, a thought stirred in every village, every city, every campfire, from the borderlands to the sea. Perhaps a kingdom could change, not by war, not by fear, but by the quiet power of being heard. The wind changed in the weeks that followed. Not in the weather, though spring had finally settled its thaw across the fields, but in the tone of the people. Where there had once been silence, there was now discussion. Where there had been blind deference, there was now careful consideration. And above all, in places where fear had rooted itself deep in the soil, there began to grow something rarer: choice. Alaric returned to the palace not as a king triumphant, but as a man deeply changed. The throne room felt smaller now. The gilded ceilings, the columns of polished stone, all the ceremony of royal power felt distant from the simple words spoken in the convocation. He sat in the royal chair, not to be revered, but to listen. Again, always to listen. Cedric noticed it first, the way the king's posture shifted, less rigid, more alert, as if the weight on his shoulders had not vanished, but finally fit. You look like a man who's starting to carry his crown, Cedric said. Alaric smiled faintly. I'm beginning to realize it's not mine alone to carry. The advisors returned to their tasks with renewed purpose. The council no longer huddled in defensive stances around maps and declarations. Instead, they planned new outreach, education initiatives in border towns, water restoration in dry provinces, traveling physicians to replace distant and neglectful barons. But trouble was never far. One morning, a rider arrived from the northern mountains bearing grim news. 3 royal messengers had disappeared near the cliffs of Kelmore. No ransom, no demands, no witnesses. Only broken saddle straps found on the side of the road. Tomas slammed his hand on the table. "This is not rebellion, it's sabotage." Reeve added, "Brennet grows bolder the more we hold back. We can't keep responding with parchment when they're using steel." But Alaric, instead of responding in fury, turned to the map. His finger slid across it, tracing a forgotten trail from Kelmore down through the valleys and into the heart of the old copper trade, territory now claimed by Brennet's sympathizers. "We'll send no army," Alaric said. "We'll send eyes," and so he did. The white veil, once cloaked in silence, now moved not just through whispers, but through witness. Not assassins, not saboteurs, but observers trained to document, to reveal. They unearthed stories of forced conscription, of local governors taking bribes in Elias Thorne's name, of families forced from homes for refusing to bow to Brennet's version of order. These stories were returned to Dareth and then shared in full. For the first time, the royal printing halls, typically reserved for decrees, published testimonies. Dozens. Pages handed out freely in markets, posted in libraries, read aloud in public squares. Not to incite, but to inform. And the people responded, some with anger, some with sorrow, but all with eyes newly opened. Meanwhile, Brennet grew impatient. Elias was no longer a passive puppet. The cousin's voice had taken on steel. He spoke at gatherings without notes. He quoted old laws and invoked new grievances. He was beginning to believe in his crown, and Brennet saw the danger. "We are not building a king," he reminded Elias one evening. "We are restoring the balance." Elias tilted his head. "Balance requires recognition. You have it. From me, but not from the people." Brennet narrowed his eyes. "You think they'll choose you over Alaric?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. In Dareth, a quiet meeting was held between Alaric and the convocation's appointed delegates. One elder rose, his hands shaking, his voice worn from years of unspoken thoughts. "You have given us voice, my king. Now we ask, what comes next?" Alaric answered without hesitation. "A kingdom that listens must also remember." He proposed the creation of a living archive, an ever-growing, publicly accessible chronicle of the realm. Every law debated, every policy explained, every voice recorded, not just from the capital, but from across the land. It would be called the People's Record. Not perfect, not swift, but honest. The convocation voted unanimously in favor. That night, work began on converting the old southern granary, abandoned for years, into the archive's first home. The crown would not just rule, it would witness. But as stone was laid and shelves were built, a new letter arrived. Not from Brennet, from Elias, addressed personally to Alaric. It was not a challenge, it was a request. A meeting between kings. Neutral ground, no guards, no fanfare. A glade known as the Hollow Ring, halfway between Dareth and Varnwick. Alaric read the letter 3 times, then set it down and called for Tomas, Cedric, and Reeve. "I will go," he said. Tomas stood. "Absolutely not. It's a trap. Then let it be a trap I walk into with open eyes." Cedric asked, "What could he possibly say that you haven't already heard from Brennet's messengers?" "I don't know," Alaric said softly, "and that is reason enough to listen." 2 days later, under the shroud of morning mist, Alaric rode to the Hollow Ring. He brought no banners, no weapons, just Cedric, Tomas, and 2 horses. Elias was already there, dressed in deep navy, his boots muddied, his face drawn, but his eyes clear. The cousins faced one another in the ring of ancient trees. No hand was extended, no smile was given, just silence. Then Elias spoke. "You could have crushed us months ago." "I could have," Alaric agreed. "You still can." "Yes." Elias looked up. "Then why haven't you?" "Because I remember what it means to build, and you've forgotten." Elias frowned. "You think I want to tear down the realm?" "I think you want the crown," Alaric said, "but not the burden that comes with it." Elias stepped forward. "The people need order, not endless debate. And you think order begins with coronation? It begins with clarity." Alaric met his gaze. "Then be clear now. Do you stand with the people or above them?" Elias hesitated, then said nothing. That was enough. Alaric turned, mounted his horse, and rode back through the fog. He did not look back. That night, the stars over Dareth seemed sharper. The palace stood quiet, but not still. In the people's record, the first page was scribed. It read, "Power does not begin with rule, it begins with responsibility." And in the western valleys, the people read it too. Some nodded, some wept, but more than a few began to hope. The days following Alaric's meeting with Elias were marked not by immediate change, but by a rising current, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Across the kingdom, the people waited. They waited not for war or peace, but for choice, and with every sunrise, that choice became more real. In Dareth, the people's record expanded rapidly. Carpenters worked day and night converting the old granary into a proper hall. Tables lined the center, not for meals, but for ink. Every town, every quarter of the city, was invited to send a scribe, a humble historian of daily life, law, and memory. For the first time in its long history, the realm would not simply remember the lives of kings and nobles. It would remember everyone. Alaric visited the archive weekly. He spoke with scribes, offered no directives, only encouragement. Sometimes he sat quietly in the corner, listening to testimonies being read aloud. Births, disputes, proposals, even moments of silence remembered from the border towns. "They're writing the soul of the realm," he told Cedric. But Cedric saw more than hope in the pages. He saw danger. "Words travel, yes," he said, "but so do flames. What we share builds trust. What they twist builds fire." He was right. In Varnwick, the reaction was swift. Brenet had expected conflict. He had prepared for battle cries and defenses, strategies to position Elias as a martyr if needed. But Alaric's strategy was something else entirely. He was dissolving the need for Brenet's war, not with victory, but with vision. That terrified him more than defeat. He summoned his inner council. They gathered in the great stone keep, seated beneath banners faded by time and ambition. "They believe he listens," Brenet said, pacing before the fire, "that he serves. Then we make him fear." A silence fell. Then a voice from the shadows spoke, a woman clad in gray, known only as Mira. Once a tactician for the border campaigns, now a ghost in the service of those who wanted the old order restored. "Words are like walls," she said. "They feel solid until the first brick cracks, then everything falls." Brenet turned. "And what would be the first brick?" She stepped forward. "The boy. Elias." Eli. In Dareth, the royal court received a letter, but not from Varnwick. It came from the northern reaches of the kingdom, where winter lingered longer and traditions died harder. It was signed by Lord Dagon of Hearthfold, a house once loyal to Alaric's father. The message was brief. "We remain neutral no longer. The people's record speaks more clearly than any sword. Dareth has our pledge." It was the first formal defection from Brenet's influence, and it mattered. Not for its military strength, but for its symbolism, a torch in the mist. Alaric called a special gathering in the convocation arena. He did not stand on the platform this time. He sat among the people, just another voice in a growing wave. When the time came for him to speak, he did so without pretense. "You were told that listening was weakness, that to rule by voice was to invite chaos. And yet, here we are, alive, working, building." He looked out at the crowd, eyes tired but calm. "Let that be our answer." But in the hills beyond the capital, a darker answer brewed. 3 nights later, Elias Thorne disappeared. Not captured, not killed, gone. His guards found his chambers undisturbed, the window cracked open, footprints vanishing into forest soil. No ransom followed, no letter, just silence. And in that silence, panic. Brenet blamed Dareth immediately. He issued a decree accusing Alaric of orchestrating the kidnapping and threatened immediate retaliation. Dareth denied all involvement. But as fear swelled in both camps, Alaric took an unusual step. He ordered the White Veil to find Elias, not for leverage, not for justice, but for protection. "We find him before they do," he told Tomas. "Because if they find him first, they'll turn him into a martyr, or worse, a weapon." People were rising once more. Days turned into a week. The People's Record continued, but its tone changed. Entries became sharper, more urgent. The people wrote of uncertainty, of fear rising once more. Some questioned whether peace was still possible. Some wondered if compromise had always been an illusion. Alaric didn't silence these voices, he published them in full. "If we cannot name our doubts," he said to the scribes, "then our faith is nothing more than denial." That same day, a courier arrived at the palace, dirt-caked near collapse, carrying only a single sealed parchment. It bore no name, just a symbol, a black crown cracked in two. Inside, a message: he is alive, but not safe, not yet. The trail led deep into the Red Pine Valley, a place long abandoned since the plague generations earlier. Once a trading hub, now a ghost of ruins and overgrowth. The White Veil moved silently, no battalions, just 4 scouts, and among the shattered stone and moss-covered stairways, they found signs, ashes of a recent fire, a cloth bearing the Thorn family crest, and eventually a boy. Thin, silent, eyes wide. He spoke only 2 words: help him. Elias was hidden in the cellar of an old chapel, barely conscious. He had not been beaten, he had been drugged. A controlled abduction, meant not to harm him, but to remove him from the board until the proper moment. When the veil brought him back to Dareth, Alaric did not place him in chains. He placed him in a healer's wing, under watch, but also under care. When Elias awoke, confused and feverish, Alaric was the first to greet him. "Why?" Elias rasped. Alaric simply answered, "Because you are still part of the realm, and I will not break it to win it." Elias stared at the ceiling for a long time, then closed his eyes, and did not speak again for 2 days. He turned to Mira. In Varnwick, Brennet stood before his map of the realm, red pins for loyalty, blue pins for dissent. The center was cracking. He could see it, and in his heart, he knew what must come next. He turned to Mira. "Ready the legions," she nodded. "Should I issue the declaration?" "No," Brennet said softly. "Let them think war is coming. Let them beg for peace. Then we strike from beneath." He placed one last pin on the map, right in the heart of Dareth. The capital was no longer a symbol, it was a target. Dareth stirred before dawn, unaware of the storm gathering beyond its walls. In the market lanes, bakers kindled their ovens. At the palace, scribes resumed their work on the People's Record. Messengers prepared horses. Life moved forward with cautious hope, because hope had become habit. But beneath this quiet rhythm, the palace guards had tightened their patrols. The White Veil reported unusual movements. Displaced villagers arriving without reason, unknown faces in taverns asking too many questions. The signs were subtle, but to Tomas and Reeve, they spoke clearly. The capital was being studied, not for diplomacy, for infiltration. Alaric stood in the highest tower that morning, gazing across the city. The rooftops glowed gold in the rising sun, the river shimmered like a ribbon of silver, and the people moved with a freedom he never wished to shatter. He heard Cedric's voice before he entered. "We intercepted a coded letter. It mentions a day of iron. No date, no location, but it's signed with the Black Crown." Alaric turned. "They mean to strike here," Cedric nodded. "Not with an army, with confusion, sabotage, division. So we have to lock down the gates, double the watch." Alaric shook his head. "If we turn the city into a fortress, we validate their fear-mongering. We can't win by hiding." Reeve, ever the realist, offered a grim compromise. "Then let the city move as it always has, but we move beneath it." The White Veil would not only watch, they would prepare. Routes were marked, safe houses restored, communication lines drawn like invisible threads through the alleys of Dareth, and most importantly, the heart of the archive, the People's Record, was quietly moved to a secret vault beneath the palace library. If the city burned, its memory would not. Meanwhile, Elias recovered. Physically, he regained strength quickly, but mentally he was silent. He asked no questions, made no demands. He watched from the window of his guest chamber, not a prisoner, but not quite free. On the 4th day, Alaric visited again. "You're safe now," he said simply. Elias didn't look away from the horizon. "Why do you keep saying that? You know I'm not." Alaric sat opposite him. "Not yet, but I'd like to believe you could be." Elias finally turned. His face was thinner than before, his eyes older. "They're going to come for me," he said. "Not because they need me, because I'm proof they've already lost." Alaric didn't deny it. "You still have a choice," he said. Elias laughed, a quiet, bitter sound. "Do I? My name has become a banner, my silence a strategy, my breath a threat." He leaned back. "I used to think power was a sword. Now I see. It's a shadow. It moves long after the man is gone." "You're not gone," Alaric said gently. "Not yet." Far beyond the city, Brennet's forces didn't wear banners. They moved like merchants, pilgrims, travelers. Their weapons were hidden beneath wagons, their maps etched into memory. And among them were whisperers, trained not to command but to confuse. The plan was not to conquer Dareth by force, it was to crumble it from within. Sabotage wells, start fires, sow rumors. Make them distrust their king, Mira had instructed. And when they do, we arrive, not as enemies, but as rescuers. The Day of Iron was never meant to begin with war. It was meant to end with surrender. Back in Dareth, a child named Nara noticed something strange. She sold bread near the southern gate with her mother, and she had a sharp eye for faces. One man kept coming back, not to buy, but to listen. He never smiled. He never looked directly at anyone, and his hands were too clean for someone wearing a merchant's coat. She told her mother told the baker told the district watch, and by sunset the man had vanished, but not before the white veil confirmed it. He had carried a map of the city's cistern system. Brennet's plan had begun. Alaric called an emergency council. "The attack has already started," Tomas said. "They want collapse before we even draw swords." Reeve agreed. "They'll strike from within, fires, panic. They'll paint us as incapable. The people will beg for strong hands." Alaric turned to Cedric. "What do we do when truth isn't loud enough?" Cedric hesitated. "Then we speak not louder, but clearer." That night, a decree was written and shared not by royal messengers, but by citizens. The king addressed the people directly. He told them of the threat, not in fear, but in trust. He explained the patterns, the false faces, the quiet war, and then he asked something rare of any ruler. He asked for help. "If you see something, say it. If you hear something, share it. We will not win this alone. We never were meant to." The message spread like a spark, but instead of fire, it lit lamps. Windows filled with candles. Shops posted hand-drawn maps of escape routes. Children whispered passwords to identify allies. Dareth became not a fortress, but a fabric, tightly woven, hard to tear. Brennet's strike team arrived 3 days later. They expected chaos. They found coordination. Wells were guarded. The archives were hidden. The fires they started were extinguished within minutes by civilians. Their maps were wrong. Their timing was off. Their whispers were met with clarity. And when Mira finally stood at the gates, ready to issue Brennet's final decree, she found a crowd. Not a mob, a witness, silent, watching. And Alaric, standing before them, no armor, no sword, just presence. "You've come to finish what shadows began," he said. Mira's voice was calm. "You've turned fear into a performance." "No," Alaric said. "We've turned fear into firewood." She didn't respond. She simply nodded and walked away. No blood was spilled that day, but a battle was lost. Not by force, by failure, by failure. That night, Elias came to Alaric's chamber unannounced. He didn't speak for a long while, then said, "They sent them to kill me, didn't they?" Alaric didn't answer. He didn't need to. Elias sat down. "I used to think power was a right," he whispered. "Now I wonder if it's just borrowed time." Alaric nodded. "Borrowed, earned, but never owned." Elias looked up. "Let me speak, not to you, to them, to the people." Alaric met his gaze. "Then speak true," and together they began writing the address. Not a renunciation, not a confession, but a beginning. One voice no longer divided. The morning Elias spoke to the people of Dareth, the city was silent in a way that wasn't empty, but expectant. Merchants paused their trade. Guards stood not in formation, but in attention. Children sat at their parents' feet, eyes wide, hands still. For once, the city's 1,000 voices hushed themselves, not by decree, but by choice. Alaric stood beside Elias on the wooden dais in Unity Square, the same square where executions were once held generations ago. Today, there were no chains, only echoes and the long shadow of possibility. Elias stepped forward, no crown, no royal cloak, just a simple deep blue tunic and the weight of what he'd nearly become. "I was born into a name," he began, "and told it meant destiny." He glanced at the crowd, not to impress them, but to find them. "They told me I would bring balance, that my bloodline was the forgotten answer, that I only had to claim what was mine." He paused, and I believed them. There was no shouting, no gasps, just listening. I believed them because it was easier than thinking, because certainty is seductive, because fear wrapped in purpose feels like truth. He looked toward the palace. "But I stand here today not to claim what is mine, but to return what never was." Murmurs moved through the crowd, gentle, uncertain, growing. Elias continued. "This city gave me safety. This man," he gestured to Alaric, "gave me dignity. And this people," he swept his hand outward, "gave me sight." His voice was steady now. "Brennet no longer speaks for me. His vision is not mine. His war is not ours." Then, softer, "If you ever believed in me, believe this. We are stronger not when we conquer each other, but when we question together." And he stepped back. Alaric did not speak after him. He only laid a hand on Elias's shoulder, and together they stood in silence as the crowd responded, not with cheers, but with a quiet reverence that was far louder than noise. Later that day, in the palace gardens, Alaric and Elias walked alone. Birds moved through the branches above, and the scent of blooming sage filled the air. "I didn't expect them to listen," Elias said. "You spoke like someone who wasn't trying to be heard," Alaric replied. "That's why they did." Elias stopped by the fountain. "I'll leave soon." "You could stay," Alaric offered. Elias shook his head. "Too many memories here, most of them not mine." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet resolve. "I'd like to help rebuild Hearthbridge," he added. "They lost too much under Brennet's reach." Alaric nodded. "It's yours if you'll lead it." "Not lead," Elias said. "Serve." For the first time, Alaric smiled. But across the sea, the winds carried darker tidings. Brennet had not vanished. His forces, while fractured, were not gone. He had retreated to the old keep of Wymarsh, a fortress surrounded by treacherous boglands and myths older than the realm itself. There he gathered the broken. Mercenaries cast out of other kingdoms, fanatics who still saw Elias as betrayed royalty, and old nobility who preferred war to humility. Mira was among them, but she no longer walked beside Brennet. She observed, and she waited. One night, in a chamber lit only by a flickering hearth, she confronted him. "You've lost their hearts," she said. "I don't need their hearts," Brennet snapped, "only their silence." "You mistake quiet for victory," he rose, "and you mistake disobedience for wisdom." She didn't flinch. "You trained me to see patterns. The pattern here is clear." Brennet drew closer, "Then follow it to the end." She turned her back to him and walked out. He didn't stop her, because he couldn't afford to admit she was right. Back in Dareth, the city had become something rare, attentive, not perfect, not healed, but awake. New laws were introduced, shaped directly from the people's record. Education councils formed in every province. Roads once left to ruin were repaired not by royal decree, but by local initiative, with resources redistributed by the crown. For the first time, the kingdom wasn't simply ruled, it participated. One evening, Reeve visited the palace with news. "The merchants of Glenvar have requested mediation for trade disputes," he said. Alaric looked up from his desk. "That's unusual." "They don't want a verdict," Reeve added. "They want a conversation, with the crown and with each other." Alaric smiled. "Then let's talk." It was slow work, but it was real. Weeks passed, then months. Elias sent letters, updates from Hearthbridge, sketches of new schools being built, plans for flood controls. He kept no title, signed only, Elias, citizen. In the north, the frost receded earlier than usual. In the south, children began naming their pets after scribes and healers instead of warriors. And in Dareth, the palace opened its gates every 7th day, not for ceremony, but for storytelling. Anyone could speak, anyone could be heard. They called it the 7th voice. Even Alaric participated. He told the story of a lantern once passed to him by a dying scout. a lantern he still kept, though it no longer lit. "Sometimes," he said, "we carry things not for their fire, but for their memory." The people understood. Then, one night, a message arrived. No name, no seal, just a phrase written in ash on parchment. "He returns with storms." No one knew what it meant, but everyone remembered who still remained beyond the horizon. Burnett was not yet finished, and as Alaric held the note, his gaze drifted toward the sea. A storm was coming, but this time, the realm would not face it with blind obedience. It would face it together. The message lingered in Alaric's mind long after it had been burned. He returns with storms. No date, no demands, just a warning, drenched in certainty. It was not written by a hand that hoped, but by one that knew. That night, sleep eluded him. He stood by the library's tall arched window, watching the stars through wavering candlelight, and wondered, how do you prepare a people not for war, but for the return of fear? By dawn, the council was summoned. Reeve, Cedric, Tomas, and the archivist Jalen sat in solemn circle. "We need to assume it means Burnett," Cedric began, "but we don't know in what form." "An army?" Tomas asked. "Assassins again? Another internal division?" Reeve, ever practical, leaned forward. "Whatever it is, it won't come as it did before. He's not aiming to conquer, he's aiming to corrupt." Silence fell. Then Alaric said, "We faced him with weapons, we faced him with words, now we face him with readiness." He looked at Jalen. "Send messages to every district. I want a week of preparation, not drills, dialogue. Let every village hold gatherings. Let them speak their fears. Let them remember that we listen." Tomas raised an eyebrow. "You're arming the people with conversations?" Alaric replied, "Yes, because when fear speaks, silence is its ally. But if every voice is loud, fear has nowhere to hide." The week was declared as the week of vigil. In the southern provinces, people gathered under olive trees and read from the people's record. In the north, fishermen spoke around driftwood fires, remembering the years of darkness and what pulled them through. In cities, musicians played ballads not of kings but of ordinary sacrifices, teachers who had taught through winter, bakers who fed others when flour was scarce, children who braved roads to carry messages. The realm, for a moment, did not brace with clenched fists. It steadied itself with memory. But not all were soothed by remembering. In Weimarsh, Brennet read the same reports. "Dialogue," he muttered, pacing before a shattered stained glass window. "They treat war like a poetry circle." Behind him stood three figures, cloaked, still, nameless, the triad, as his new advisors called themselves. They spoke little, but advised much. In recent months, their influence had grown, whispering of older powers, of ancestral rights lost to time and fear. "They believe the realm is awake," one of the triad murmured. "Then let us show them," another said, "what dreams still slumber beneath their soil." Brennet turned. "Dareth is no longer fragile. I need more than swords." "You need myth," the third whispered. "You need them to doubt reality." Brennet paused. A slow smile crept to his face. "Then we give them a storm they won't believe is real." On the 6th day of the week of vigil, strange things began to happen. A statue in the town of Eldmere wept water from stone. A tree in Vanderfield blossomed red leaves overnight, though it was spring. A child in Trusca was said to speak in voices not her own. Alaric received the reports within hours. "This is theater," Tomas said. "False miracles, designed to confuse." "But why now?" Cedric asked. "They're not even violent acts." Alaric stood over the parchment spread across the war table. "Because Brennet knows we're no longer afraid of war, so now he offers wonder. He trades in awe to break our sense of truth." He looked up. "And if people cannot trust their eyes, they'll trust fear instead." So Alaric responded not with denial, but with exposure. He sent scribes, scholars, and witnesses to every event site. Their task was not to disprove, but to observe, record, and share transparently. At Eldmere, they found hidden pipes beneath the statue. At Vanderfield, red dye was discovered in soil around the tree roots. The girl in Trusca, a ventriloquist's device, planted under her bed. It was not about mocking belief, it was about naming illusion. Alaric addressed the realm through the record. Let us believe in beauty. Let us believe in things beyond ourselves. But let us never forget, truth welcomes questions. Lies demand silence. The people responded. They did not stop gathering. They just brought lanterns now to see clearly. Frustrated, Brennet changed tactics. He turned to the triad. Enough shadows. Give me something real. One stepped forward, laying a scroll before him. Then strike not at his people, the figure said, but at his foundation, the crown itself. Brenet unrolled the scroll. A name was written there. Darian Thorn, Alaric's cousin, half forgotten by the realm, living quietly in a border province. Blood, Brenet whispered, the last claim. The plan was set. Darian would be taken, then declared as the rightful heir, lured with promises or used as a puppet. Either way, it would fracture the unity Alaric had built. But the Triad had their own plan as well, and it did not end with Darian. In the quiet village of Blackmere, Darian Thorn did not know that his life was about to become the cornerstone of a new storm. He spent his days helping farmers, reading old tomes, and tending to a neglected library. He had no interest in rule, no desire for power, but he carried the blood of kings. And sometimes that is enough for others to write your story for you. On the 7th day of the week of vigil, a lone rider arrived at Dareth's gate. Dust-covered, bleeding, barely conscious. But he carried Darian's seal, and a single sentence scrawled in haste, "They've taken him." The palace fell still. No battle had begun, no sword had been drawn. But the silence cracked. Alaric read the message once more. Then he turned to his council. "Prepare a delegation. Not an army, I will go myself." Thomas objected immediately. "You're the crown, you don't leave the city. If I stay," Alaric replied, "they control the story. If I go, we speak our own." Cedric said nothing, but his eyes held approval. It was not recklessness, it was leadership, and it was dangerous. But sometimes, danger is the only honest reply to deceit. That evening, as the people lit their final lanterns for the week of vigil, Alaric stood once more in Unity Square. This time he spoke with brevity. "Storms come not to destroy, but to test the strength of what stands." He held the note high. "They've taken one of us, not a symbol, a person." His voice grew firm. "And we will bring him home, not with war, not with whispers, but with witness." The people didn't cheer, they simply nodded, for they understood the journey was not over, and truth must be carried, even into the storm. The delegation set out before dawn. Alaric rode at the head, not in royal armor, but in the simple leather coat he wore before becoming king. With him were Thomas, Cedric, 2 White Veil agents riding under false names, and 6 hand-picked riders. No banners, no fanfare, just speed and silence. The air was heavy with anticipation, as if even the horses sensed they were not galloping into a border dispute, but into something far older, deeper, more dangerous. They followed the old trade route east, a winding path through thick forests and fog-soaked valleys toward the province of Blackmere. It would take them 3 days, riding fast. Reeve remained behind in Dareth, entrusted with the realm's safety. Elias, now in Hearthbridge, was already mobilizing quiet support across towns in the west in case the situation deepened. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. This wasn't just about Darian. It was about what Darian represented. A fracture waiting to be exploited. A ghost of legitimacy. A name with just enough royal blood to unsettle everything Alaric had built. On the second night, they camped near the cliffs of Veller's Drop, where the wind spoke in strange whistles through the stone. Thomas sat sharpening his blade while Cedric mapped their current position. Alaric sat apart, reading the last letter he'd received from Darian. It was 2 years old, full of bookish rambling, half-formed questions about early royal decrees, and the kind of philosophical musings only someone untouched by politics could afford. "You were always the flame," Darian had written. "I was content being the hearth." Now the hearth was missing, and someone else had lit the match. And then a philosophical militia. They reached Blackmere by midday on the 3rd day, but what greeted them wasn't a battle-scarred village or hostile militia. It was emptiness. Shutters were closed, market stalls abandoned, carts overturned, not in violence, but in retreat. Cedric dismounted first, scanning the scene. They cleared out days ago, probably forced or frightened. Inside the small town hall, the dust had not yet settled. Papers lay scattered, parchment detailing community water rotations, tax receipts, notes from a recent harvest festival. There were no signs of struggle, only sudden interruption. In the back chamber, a single word was carved crudely into the wall. Oathbreaker. Tomas stared at it for a long time. They mean Darien? Cedric shook his head. They mean us. Alaric remained silent. But he noticed something strange, a book left open on the long oak table. It was an atlas of old pilgrimage sites, and one village name was circled twice in charcoal: Stonefield. Stonefield sat at the edge of the known kingdom, where maps faded into folklore and roads became trails. It was a place of retreat for exiled priests and wandering scholars, but it was also close to Wymarsh. Too close. Alaric gave the order. We ride there next. The journey took another day, and as they approached Stonefield at dusk, the clouds gathered thick over the horizon. Thunder rolled, low, deliberate, as if the land itself was preparing for judgment. They left the horses at the forest's edge and moved in on foot. The village was nestled in a bowl of hills, silent beneath the storm. And in the center, surrounded by 30 armed men in dark gray cloaks, stood a man in royal blue. Darien. His hands were bound, but his stance was upright, and his face, when he saw Alaric, did not register surprise, only relief. Then sorrow. The guards turned at the first sound of boots on gravel. Cedric raised both hands. We're not here for blood. The leader of the gray-cloaked men stepped forward. A scar ran down his cheek, and his eyes glinted with disdain. You bring no flag, he said. We bring no threat, Alaric replied. You bring a king. You bring a king. I bring a brother. A pause. Then the man said, we were told he would be tried, not traded. Tomas frowned. Tried for what? The man's jaw tightened. For failing his blood. Darien finally spoke. Don't waste your breath. They've been fed a vision. A kingdom restored to purity. A crown worn by birthright, not choice. He looked directly at Alaric. I told them I wanted no part of it, so they took me to make it look like I had. Cedric asked the man, who gave the order? The man didn't answer, but Darien did. Brunette. Alaric nodded. Then let him hear this. He stepped forward toward the circle. Alone. Darien Thorne is no pretender. He is no usurper. He is my kin, and his choice, freely made, is to serve, not rule. He drew a scroll from his coat. This is a decree, witnessed, sealed. It places Darien under royal protection, and it condemns any manipulation of royal lineage as a crime against unity. One of the guards scoffed. A piece of paper? Alaric met his eyes. No. A promise. The guards did not attack, but they did not move either. It was Darien who finally acted. He walked forward, chains clinking, and said, if you truly believe in the bloodline, then believe this. I am of it, and I choose him. He pointed to Alaric. Silence. Then the leader nodded once and dropped his sword. The others followed. The storm above finally broke, but it brought rain, not war. They stayed the night in Stonefield. Darien, free now, sat with Alaric by a fire in a hollowed-out shrine. You should have left me, Darien said softly. No, Alaric replied. You should never have been taken. Darien shook his head. They'll try again, with someone else, another name, another story. Alaric poured tea into 2 cups. Then we make sure the story doesn't change every time a shadow whispers. How? Alaric looked at the flames. We build a realm that doesn't need royalty to feel real. He handed Darien a cup. And we start by making sure your voice doesn't vanish again. Darien smiled. You've changed. Alaric chuckled. You haven't. That's why you're still alive. Outside, the storm faded, and in its place a dawn prepared itself, quiet, persistent, and waiting. Morning in Stonefield arrived with a hush, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The rain had washed the village clean, leaving puddles that reflected the pink-orange sky like shards of forgotten glass. Alaric stood outside the old shrine, watching villagers slowly re-emerge. They peeked out from behind doors and curtains, not with fear, but curiosity. like dreamers waking unsure whether the nightmare had truly passed. Darian joined him, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "They're waiting for something," Alaric nodded. "They're waiting for permission to believe this isn't just another chapter in someone else's war." He turned to face his cousin. "We're going to give them that." They didn't leave Stonefield right away. Instead, Alaric declared 3 days of stay, not for strategic purposes, not to plan the next move, but to listen. He met with the elders, sat through town circles, ate in crowded kitchens, and walked through fields where no king had ever stepped foot. People told stories, not of politics, but of livestock stolen in the night, of water shortages, of children who walked 3 leagues just to learn to write their names. Darian, at first hesitant, began doing the same. The people warmed to him. He was bookish, yes, but gentle and surprisingly funny. Children tugged at his coat and asked if he was really royalty. He laughed and replied, "Only by accident." That honesty made them trust him more. On the second day, a boy named Rian approached Alaric holding a small wooden box. "I made this," he said shyly, opening it to reveal a carved figurine. It was crude but unmistakable. A figure standing tall, arms wide, no crown. Alaric knelt. "Who is it?" Rian answered, "It's a king who listens." Alaric said nothing for a moment. Then he took the carving gently, placed it in his satchel, and said, "That's the best kind of king to be." Meanwhile, in Wymarsh, Brennet stood before a fire built not for warmth, but for ritual. The triads surrounded him, each holding a candle flickering blue-white. "They brought him back," Brennet said. "We expected that," one of them whispered, "but something else returned with him." "What?" "Doubt," another murmured. "Yours." Brennet turned sharply. "I do not doubt." The triad moved closer, but their voices now a single chord. "Then prove it. Show them the storm they've never feared." He raised his hand, and a new decree was written, one that would shatter illusion and plunge the realm into choice, not war, not peace, but reckoning. Mike. The next morning, a bird arrived in Stonefield. Not a dove, not a raven, but a falcon with royal blue bands on its legs, a color reserved only for emergencies. Thomas untied the scroll and read it aloud in Alaric's chamber. "To the realm, let it be known that Darian Thorn has accepted the mantle of High Steward in the kingdom of Wymarsh. Let it be known that he denounces the illegitimacy of King Alaric's claim and calls for an assembly of all loyal bloodlines. Let it be known that this is not a war, but a correction. Signed, Darian Thorn." Stamped with the sigil of Wymarsh. Darian stood in stunned silence. Alaric simply said, "He forged your name." Darian's hands trembled. "And with it, half the kingdom will believe I've turned." Cedric cursed under his breath. "It's not just political, it's spiritual. He's making a symbol out of you." Tomas added, "And he's giving the nobles a reason to delay reforms, a reason to hesitate." Alaric's eyes narrowed. "Then we won't hesitate." He turned to Darian. "Would you speak to the realm?" Darian looked startled. "I've never." "You don't have to be perfect," Alaric said. "Just honest." Darian paused, then nodded. 2 days later, in the grand square of Hearthbridge, Darian stood upon a wooden platform, not in royal garments, but in the simple green cloak of a record keeper. All across the realm, people gathered by lantern light to hear the speech, broadcast through echo stones and carried by runners. Darian took a deep breath and began. "My name is Darian Thorn, and I am not your king." He let that sink in. "I never sought the crown. I was raised among books, not blades. I was taught that stories shape nations more than swords, and I tell you now, the story they are spreading is false." He held up the forged decree. "This is a lie. My name has been used without my will, and I reclaim it now, not to rule, but to refuse." A murmur rose in the crowd. Darian continued, "I am no threat to King Alaric. I am his ally. I saw the way he governs, through listening, not fear. Through presence, not pageantry. That's the leadership this realm deserves." His voice steadied. "So if you must believe in bloodlines, believe in the blood that chooses peace, that bends but does not break, that defends but does not dominate." He lowered the scroll. "I stand with the king, not because I must, but because I choose to. The response was immediate. Towns sent public declarations of support. Villages painted over old family crests and raised the new mark of Dareth, a simple oak leaf, symbolizing resilience and growth. Even former critics of Alaric admitted that his refusal to silence Darien had proved his humility and strength. In Wymarsh, the Triad fumed. He's turned the people against the myth. Brennet paced the hall. No, not against. He's made them want something new. One of the Triad hissed, then destroy what is new. Make them mourn what they hoped for. Brennet's eyes went cold. Send the Flame Riders. That night, in the quiet farming village of Wexley, 6 cloaked riders appeared just before midnight. By morning, the granary was burning. By noon, the well was poisoned. By sunset, 3 families were missing. And on the charred wall of the town center, a single message had been etched in smoke. Peace is a lie. When word reached Alaric, he didn't shout. He didn't pace. He simply sat still, reading the report over and over, as if hoping the words would fade with repetition. Darien stood behind him. What do we do? Alaric looked up. We do what they can't. He stood. We mourn. Then we rebuild. Then we speak. Tomas asked, what do we say? Alaric's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of every lantern, every fire, every story ever shared across the realm. We say, this is not the end, and the realm, battered but unbroken, lit its lamps again, not in celebration but in defiance, because even in the dark, light remembers. Smoke still drifted from the ruins of Wexley as Alaric's delegation arrived. The smell of scorched grain clung to the wind, and the silence was heavier than ash. No cries, no voices, just the creak of collapsed beams and the hiss of embers cooling in the dirt. Alaric dismounted slowly. He didn't speak. Neither did Cedric or Tomas. The villagers who survived, those who had hidden in cellars or escaped to nearby fields, emerged cautiously. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths tight. They had seen what cruelty looked like without masks. A small girl no older than 6 approached Alaric and handed him a burnt doll. Half its face had melted away. Her name was Mina, she whispered. They stepped on her. Alaric knelt, accepting the doll like it was a relic. He didn't try to comfort her with promises. Instead, he said, thank you. She'll be remembered. Behind him, Tomas turned away to hide his expression. Cedric remained still, but his hands were clenched. But Alaric didn't wait to send a message. By evening, the delegation had established a relief post. Tents were set up, medics tended wounds, artisans rebuilt walls, scribes recorded testimonies. But Alaric didn't wait to send a message. That night, standing atop the same platform Darien had once used in Hearthbridge, Alaric addressed the realm again. He held up the charred remains of Mina's doll. This, he said, is what fear looks like when it believes it is power. He turned, showing the broken figure to the gathered crowd and to every echo stone transmitting his voice across cities, fields, and rivers. They burned wheat, they burned homes, but they cannot burn the one thing we all carry, choice. He lowered his hand. This is not vengeance, this is resolve. For every village razed, we will raise 2 more. For every lie whispered, we will speak louder. And for every silence forced upon us, we will answer with stories that cannot be erased. He paused, then said, we are not afraid. The crowd didn't cheer. They placed lamps in a circle around the square. And from that night forward, every village kept a circle of lights glowing until dawn. They called it the Ring of Witness. Meanwhile in Wymarsh, Brennet watched the broadcast with a storm behind his eyes. He's turned tragedy into strength, he said to the Triad. Even the fire failed to divide them. One of the cloaked figures responded, then burn not their homes, burn their past. Another added, they cling to memory, so shatter memory. Brennet turned. You want to erase their history? No, the third answered. We want to rewrite it. The plan unfolded quietly. Across smaller towns and provinces sympathetic to Wymarsh, loyalist officials began removing the new symbols of Dareth. Oak leaf banners were replaced with older family crests. Public record halls were raided. Testimonies from the last war were taken. Many burned, some altered. It was done with care, subtle enough that no single act caused alarm. But together, they created confusion. In one town, a mother swore her husband had died protecting a Dareth convoy. The town ledger now listed him as a deserter. In another, a school no longer taught about the Storm Accord, the moment when 5 provinces united under Alaric. The pages were gone. The intent was clear: fracture the realm by making people unsure what had ever been true. When this reached Alaric, he gathered a council of archivists, messengers, and historians in Dareth. "We must respond quickly," Cedric urged. "Punish every official participating." But Alaric raised a hand. "No, truth doesn't return through punishment." He turned to Jalen, the head archivist. "We need the witnesses." The witnesses were a group of wandering chroniclers, old, eccentric, trusted by no one and everyone. They carried no allegiance except to memory. Their writings were scattered, sometimes contradictory, always handwritten, but they had seen everything. Alaric's plan was simple: gather the witnesses, have them speak in public forums, share first-hand stories of the war, the accords, the pain, and the rebuilding. Not from scrolls, not through titles, but through voice. People could burn documents, but they could not erase the words that reached a neighbor's ear. Within a fortnight, the witnesses began to speak. They appeared in marketplaces, town halls, libraries, even in taverns. One, an old woman named Fenya, stood atop a barrel in a village square and said, "I buried my own son after the siege of Lysand. He died not because of a sword, but because fear made good people stay silent. That silence is creeping back now. Are you going to let it eat your children too?" A crowd had gathered, and no one looked away. Back in Stonefield, Darian had returned, now officially named Alaric's Chancellor of Memory, a newly created role. His task was to preserve truth, not as a rigid history, but as a living dialogue. He began traveling across the provinces, conducting interviews, collecting personal stories from farmers, traders, midwives, former soldiers. He called it the living record. When asked why, he replied, "Because Brennet builds his foundation on forgotten things, so we will make forgetting impossible." But Brené was not idle. Seeing that fire and falsehood had failed, he moved to his final play. He summoned a conclave of mercenary lords, outsiders with no stake in the realm's future. He offered them coin, land, and titles. In return, they would march on Dareth itself, not as an army of war, but as a restoration force meant to liberate the city from Alaric's illusion. He gave them forged documents, false decrees, and even actors to play betrayed nobles. It was not just a coup. It was a performance, designed to confuse the people long enough for power to shift. The attack was set for the Feast of the Lanterns, when the capital would be flooded with music, families, and firelight, when no one would expect war. Alaric sensed something was coming, not through scouts or spies, but through silence. Too many messengers went missing, too many reports stopped mid-sentence, and worst of all, Brennet stopped speaking. One evening, as the feast preparations glowed around him, Alaric said to Tomas, "History is a fragile thing. We treat it like a mirror, but it's more like a flame." Tomas nodded. "And what happens if they try to blow it out?" Alaric turned, his eyes sharp. "Then we become the fire." At midnight, 2 nights before the feast, a child arrived at the palace gates. She carried no weapon, only a small scroll tied in blue thread. It read, "They come not with drums, but with masks. Their truth is louder than yours, but only if you stay quiet." Alaric read it twice. Then he whispered, "So we speak louder." And all across the capital, he ordered a single message carved into the city walls, posted on doors, spoken by town criers. "Truth is not still. It moves with us." And when the false army arrived, it would find a city not afraid, but ready. The Feast of the Lanterns had always been a night of warmth. For generations, it marked the end of harvest and the turning of season, a time when families gathered beneath flickering lanterns, and old songs rose like soft fire through narrow alleys. Children chased each other with glowing orbs tied to sticks. Lovers carved wishes into petals and sent them down the river, and the city pulsed not with duty, but with joy. This year, however, there was tension in the glow. Alaric stood atop the western wall of Dareth, looking down at the celebration below. The city shone like a living constellation, but every fourth lantern had been marked, not with color, but with placement. An old code, a signal passed among guards, trusted vendors, watchmen, and those trained by the white veil. Each marked lantern meant a house prepared, a street trained, a rooftop armed, quietly, invisibly. If the false army came cloaked in festival cheer, they would find that Dareth could sing and sharpen at the same time. Tomas stepped beside the king, holding a slender report. It's confirmed. They're gathering 3 miles out, disguised as pilgrims, merchants, even traveling mummers. Alaric didn't flinch. How many? At least 2,000. Not all fighters, but enough for chaos. Cedric arrived moments later, helmet under his arm. They're betting on confusion, not conquest. They want to make the people unsure of who owns the city. Alaric replied, then we don't fight their numbers. We fight their illusion. Earlier that week, Darian had begun broadcasting public dialogues from within the royal court. Open talks where citizens were invited to ask questions, raise doubts, even criticize. Some thought it dangerous, but Alaric insisted if the kingdom was to resist lies, it had to become fluent in truth. Now, on the night of the feast, Darian stood in the central amphitheater, surrounded by hundreds. He didn't speak of war. He told stories. A baker who once gave his last loaf to a soldier and later found his daughter protected during a raid. A mason who lost an arm rebuilding Hearthbridge but used his other to train apprentices. An orphan who learned to read using royal decrees pinned in public squares, then went on to teach 20 more children. These were not heroic legends. They were the kingdom, not made of crowns but of choice, and every person who listened left with more than memory. They left with allegiance, not to Alaric's blood, but to the idea that they were part of something. At the outer gates of Dareth, the mercenary lords approached under cover of torchlight. Their banners rolled tight, their shields painted with sigils borrowed from long-dead noble houses. They expected guards. They expected confusion. They did not expect a silent street lined with open windows where citizens watched not in fear, but in quiet alertness. A rider approached the gatekeeper. "We are here for the festival," he announced, his accent thick with coin. The gatekeeper nodded, unblinking. "And what is the festival's vow?" he asked. The rider blinked. "To light what was dark." A pause, then the gatekeeper smiled faintly. Wrong year. The doors didn't close. They swung wide open, but behind them not festival lanterns, but lines of quiet defenders stood shoulder to shoulder, unarmored but ready. The white veil moved without sound. Traps had already been placed, and the moment the mercenaries stepped forward, the illusion collapsed. The streets of Dareth became a labyrinth. False soldiers turned corners, only to be surrounded by shopkeepers wielding crossbows, or children leading them into false alleys. Tomas, riding hard through the western quarter, gave a simple command to his squad: "Don't kill, reveal." And so, for the first time in recorded memory, a city under attack defended itself without drawing blood. Banners were snatched, disguises torn, and in every square, actors hired by Brenate were unmasked before crowds. One wept, another confessed, a third simply ran. By midnight, the mercenary army was not captured. It was humiliated. Brennet received the news before dawn. "They let them walk?" he snarled. "They stripped them," the triad corrected. "Not of clothes, of meaning." One cloaked figure added, "And that is worse. To be fought is one thing, to be dismissed is another." Brene's hand shook. "They mock me with civility, they shame me with peace." A triad voice hissed, "Because peace is the only sword they trust." "Then we find a sharper one," Brene snapped. But even he sounded unsure, because somewhere deep he knew his war no longer had an audience. In Dareth, the aftermath of the attempted deception was not celebrated with fireworks. It was honored in silence. Alaric addressed the city not with speeches, but with presence. He walked markets, thanked bakers, sat on crates beside stonecutters. He carried a child whose mother had guarded a lantern post all night. He took no bow, wore no crown, Instead, he whispered a single phrase again and again. You kept the story alive. That night, the kingdom slept with lanterns still burning, not because they feared the dark, but because they had chosen to stay awake. And far from the capital, in a ruined tower once used as a lookout, a boy named Len stood holding a rusted spyglass. He had watched the city flicker through its longest night, and now as dawn stretched across the hills, he turned to his sister and said, "We don't have to run anymore, do we?" She smiled. "No," she said. "Now we walk toward the light." The sun crept over the horizon like a secret unfolding, warm, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. In the capital, the first morning after the failed masquerade arrived with birdsong and fresh bread, no horns blared, no victory banners were hoisted, but something deeper had changed. It wasn't triumph the people felt, it was clarity. In the heart of Dareth, the circle of witness, the ring of lanterns lit in defiance was still burning even after the long night. Children came by with new candles. Elders poured oil reverently. It had become a ritual not ordered by a king, but born from the will of the people. Their story was no longer something told to them. It was something they carried together. Alaric rose early, as always. He had never been one for celebration. His gaze lingered on the tower across from the palace, an old watchtower unused for years, now manned again. Not with guards, but with citizens who volunteered for shifts, not to spy, but to see. Behind him, Darian entered quietly, holding a freshly transcribed journal. The people of Vale's End have begun writing public songs about the failed coup, he said with a hint of amusement. Apparently, one of the mercenary captains tripped into a melon cart. Alaric raised an eyebrow. Justice through humiliation. The bards strike again. But then he turned serious. They'll come again, Darian nodded. Yes, but not the same way. They'll change shape, maybe even change voice. Alaric set down his tea. Then, we make truth louder. In the countryside, ripples of the failed deception spread quickly. Messengers and travelers carried stories of a capital that had not only survived an attack, but transformed it. Not by sword, but by coordination, by community. The idea that every citizen mattered had taken root in ways no decree could achieve, and that terrified those who ruled through fear. In the fortress of Grey Hollow, a meeting of noble dissenters erupted into shouting. "They've turned peasants into philosophers," roared Lord Wren. "They quote speeches in the market. They organize cleanup brigades without being told. It's unnatural." Lady Syra, seated across from him in layered red silks, calmly stirred her tea. "It's not unnatural. It's dangerous. A kingdom ruled by thought instead of blood is hard to bribe," someone muttered, "or threaten." The room fell into uneasy silence. Back in Dareth, Tomas met with the White Veil's senior coordinators. Their focus had shifted. No longer just intelligence gathering, but civic training. The very people who had watched lanterns during the feast were now being trained to spot misinformation, track irregularities, and record village oral histories for preservation. Knowledge, Tomas said to the gathered group, is now our strongest wall. At the same time, Cedric oversaw drills, not for war, but for response. Fires, famines, floods. He turned the old military structure into a readiness force, blending strategy with humility. "These aren't battalions," he told a group of new recruits. "They're neighbors who know what to do when the river rises." Across the land, transformation wasn't being enforced. It was spreading. But not all were convinced. An emissary arrived from the outer province of Kaelmore, where Lord Heron still ruled with strict tradition. He brought a message sealed in wax and a veiled threat in his eyes. Lord Heron's words were polite, but underneath, poisonous. "We recognize the strength of King Alaric's leadership. We merely caution that fire spreads easily in dry fields. Be sure your new ideas don't burn the very roots they rise from." Alaric didn't respond with anger. He invited the emissary to dinner. At the table, flanked by artists, bakers, guards, and even a local teacher, Alaric said, "Roots are important, but sometimes trees must grow in new directions." The emissary returned to Kaelmore pale and shaken. Not from any threat, but from the realization that this was a kingdom no longer ruled by spectacle. It was ruled by quiet strength. Weeks passed. The harvest began. Fields turned golden. Children studied in open-air classrooms. Lantern circles became places of music, of storytelling, of shared decision-making. And then came the message that changed everything. A bird, black as coal and twice as fast as normal falcons, arrived at the castle bearing a scroll with no seal. Tomas brought it to Alaric, who read it aloud. There is another. Her name is Sarah. She remembers, and she waits beneath the ancient stone, where voices echo and kings once swore oaths. Darian leaned forward. The Echo Vault? Cedric narrowed his eyes. That place hasn't been used in 100 years, Tomas added. No one goes near it now. The stones are said to sing, even when no wind passes. Alaric looked at the note again. Then we go. The Echo Vault lay buried in the Vale of Murin, hidden beneath a crag of worn hills and old thorn trees. It had once served as the original royal chamber before palaces were built and courts devised. Its design was simple, a natural cave, lined with layered stone that reverberated even the smallest whisper. Here in days gone by, kings made oaths because their voices could not hide. Alaric, Darian, Tomas, and Cedric traveled lightly. No guards, no symbols. They reached the entrance just before dusk. A young woman waited. She wore no crest. Her clothes were travel-worn. But her eyes, gray, calm, piercing, held an ageless clarity. You are Sarah? Alaric asked. She nodded. And you, remember? She smiled faintly. More than you do, more than he ever wanted anyone to. She turned, leading them inside, and as they crossed the threshold, the air shifted, not colder, not heavier, but honest, because here even silence had memory. Sarah led them to a central chamber. Carved into the walls were names, dozens of them, some ancient, some forgotten, but all had ruled or tried to. This, she said, is the ledger of those who chose truth over power. She pointed to a blank space. There is room for one more. Alaric stared at it. Darian whispered, "Why now?" Sarah replied, "Because he's building something darker. Not just armies, belief. He doesn't want to rule the kingdom. He wants to replace it." Tomas tensed. How? Sarah knelt and brushed dirt from a corner of the floor. Beneath was a circle of glyphs, glowing faintly. By rewriting the oath, she said. If he stands here and speaks his truth into these stones, the realm won't remember the old ways. It will only echo his version. They stared at the circle in silence. And Alaric finally spoke. Then we cannot let him arrive first. Because now the war was no longer for land. It was for memory itself. The return journey from the Echo Vault was filled with silence. Not the awkward kind, but the kind weighted with realization. The kind that follows the discovery of a deeper game. One that had always been in play, even when no one had noticed the board. Sarah traveled with them now. She did not speak often, but when she did, her words felt measured, like chisel marks in stone. Alaric rode beside her through the shaded passes of Murin and asked only once, "How long have you known?" She didn't look at him. "Since the day I forgot my brother's face, but remembered the lies he left in its place." They said no more until the lights of Dareth appeared on the horizon. She didn't look at him. Back in the capital, preparations began immediately. Darian ordered scribes to begin documenting every living testimony from citizens who had lived through the last regime. The royal archives were open to the public for the first time in history, and scrolls once deemed non-essential were copied and distributed across the provinces. Meanwhile, Tomas met with the Council of Stones, an ancient circle of architects, engineers, and memory keepers who once guarded the design of places like the Echo Vault. What Brené wants isn't just influence, Tomas told them. He wants resonance. He wants the realm to sing his song, even after he's gone. The council members, most of them bent with age and heavy with secrets, nodded grimly. One of them, a woman named Oren, placed a single carved stone on the table. "Then we must build an answer," she said. "Not to destroy his version, but to outlast it." Alaric convened a private council that evening, inviting only Darian, Tomas, Cedric, and Sarah. They met in the observatory at the palace summit, surrounded by maps, constellations, and glowing memory threads projected through old veil technology. Sarah stood in front of them, her voice quiet but firm. Brennett doesn't believe in ruling. He believes in editing. He's already replaced 5 public ledgers. He's rewritten laws into folk songs, even dreams. Cedric blinked. Dreams? She nodded. There's a temple in Kalemore. They use a plant that induces prophetic visions. He started seeding it with his own version of the past. Darian leaned forward. So truth isn't just under attack, it's being rewired. Alaric folded his hands. Then it's time we stop defending. They all turned to him. We fight back, he said, not with armies, but with remembrance. The operation was named Project Hearthroot. Its goal was simple: create a network of truth-bearing sites across the realm. Places where memories were anchored, layered with personal stories, ancestral witness, and symbols that could not be easily erased. Not just history written, but lived. Each Hearthroot was to be embedded in everyday life: a bakery, a well, a schoolhouse, ordinary places filled with extraordinary memory. And each would contain 3 things. 1. A living ledger. Testimonies updated weekly from citizens. 2. A truth circle. A physical ring of local stones infused with resonant markings meant to carry sound memory into the walls. 3. A mirror flame. A quiet fire that reflected not faces, but moods. It would glow warmly when surrounded by agreement, flicker wildly in deceit, and dim when silence lingered too long. Alaric personally visited the first site, a tiny village outside Valmir where a boy named Lynn had once guided lost soldiers home during a storm. The town hall, no larger than a barn, was transformed into the first Hearthroot. On opening day, he said only this: "Here we do not store truth, we grow it." The flame lit cleanly, and did not waver, gathered in secret, but even as the roots spread, so did the shadow. Brennett, aware that his control of narrative was slipping, turned to a final gambit: the Shadow Book. It was said to be a collection of counter-stories, gathered in secret, altered and rewritten from existing testimonies, then bound in a book that could only be read under eclipse. Its goal: to present an alternate version of the last 50 years, one where Alaric was the usurper, the war never ended, and the Triad had saved the realm from collapse. Those who read it experienced not confusion, but certainty. The certainty that the lies were truth. It was not persuasion. It was belief, planted like a seed, and it was spreading. Sarah intercepted one of the Shadow Book's distributors outside Stonefield. A young man, no older than 17, wore the mark of the Triad on his belt and spoke in rehearsed phrases. She cornered him beside a well. "You believe it?" she asked softly. He nodded. "It makes more sense than everything else." "What about your mother's story? She lost her brother in the siege." He blinked. "That never happened." Sarah stared into his eyes. "I was there." He hesitated. "Just enough." And she handed him a stone. It bore a memory glyph. When he touched it, his fingers trembled. He saw, not an idea, but a face. A boy, broken and brave, standing in a flooded hallway, calling for help. His uncle. And he remembered. The young man fell to his knees, not in guilt, but in recovery. Sarah whispered, "The truth isn't always a weapon. Sometimes it's a rescue." By the end of that month, the Shadow Book was declared a threat. Not banned, because Alaric refused censorship, but answered. For every copy distributed, a Hearthroot would publish the counter-memory. For every lie, a testimony. The realm became a great echo chamber, not of slogans, but of stories. And the people were no longer listeners, they were participants. Children recited not battle dates, but personal legacies. Lantern circles now taught poetry based on family archives. Fishermen told tales of rivers they'd saved, merchants sang ballads of debt forgiven, and midwives kept names. Every child born since the war was remembered aloud at every festival, so that forgetting became impossible. Then came a final message from the Echo Vault. One night, the stones sang again, without wind. The watchers recorded the tone and brought it to Alaric. Sarah listened carefully, then translated. "He's coming, not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim." Darian narrowed his eyes. "He's going to try and enter the vault himself, Tomas rose. "He wants to rewrite the oath." Sarah met Alaric's gaze. "And if he speaks his version into those stones, the realm may not know the difference." Alaric stood slowly. "Then we go back?" Darian asked. "To stop him?" Alaric shook his head. "To stand beside him," he said, "and speak louder." Part 21. The journey back to the Echo Vault was unlike the first. This time it wasn't quiet. This time it wasn't hidden. Word had spread fast, faster than even the swiftest couriers. The king was returning to the oldest chamber in the realm, and so was the man who meant to undo him. Across valleys and ridges, from towns small and large, people began to move, not to flee, but to witness. Like gravity pulling water downhill, they came. On foot, on horseback, in carts and carriages. Entire villages closed shops. School teachers paused lessons. Lantern circles emptied. They all moved toward Murin. The Echo Vault, once silent and buried, now stood watched from every slope, every clearing, every rise. Torches ringed the valley in a quiet vigil, not of fear, but of readiness. At the center of it all stood Alaric. No crown, no throne, only a weathered cloak and a memory stone at his belt. Beside him stood Tomas, ever steady. Darian, pale with worry but sharp with hope. Cedric, armored not for battle but for truth. And Sarah silent, her eyes watching the wind. They waited at the entrance. And then, as twilight began to fall, the sound of hooves rose on the southern trail. He was coming. He was coming. Brené rode without pageantry. No banners, no fanfare. Only 6 companions, cloaked and close. He wore black, not the ceremonial kind, but the kind that absorbed light and refused reflection. His hair had gone white in streaks, not from age, but from intention. Even his horse seemed unnaturally still. He dismounted wordlessly. His eyes met Alaric's, and for a long moment no one moved. Then Alaric stepped forward, not with a sword, but with an open hand. "You came as you promised," he said. Brennet nodded once. "This place calls for truth, and truth does not hide." Without another word, both men turned toward the vault and entered. Only they, Sarah, and the 4 companions followed. Everyone else remained outside. This was not a battle of armies. This was a war of oaths. The Echo Vault was colder than before, as if it sensed what was at stake. They walked slowly through the stone corridor, past the Chamber of Names, past the mirror arch until they reached the central circle, the heart ring. There it lay, still pulsing with old energy, still layered with every vow ever spoken into its walls. This was the place where kings were once crowned, not by touch, but by echo, where the stones remembered who was worthy and who was false. Sarah stepped to the side and held out 2 memory stones, one for each man. Alaric took his. So did Brennet. Then they entered the circle together, and silence fell. Brené spoke first. "I remember the day the war ended. The banners were torn, the cities burning, and the people lost." His voice echoed not as sound, but as feeling. The walls absorbed it. "I remember offering a future, one with order, one without kings or thrones, just structure, but they chose you." His tone did not rise, it didn't need to. "They chose songs and symbols, they chose hope, and I saw then what I had to do, write something stronger, more lasting than flesh." Alaric replied calmly, "You chose to erase, not to rebuild." Brennet turned. "Because memory is flawed, it fades. I wanted to give them something unchangeable." Alaric stepped forward. "But you gave them silence. You took away pain, yes, but also joy. You carved away the crooked lines that made them real." He raised his stone. "I don't want to overwrite history. I want to hold it, just as it is, in all its imperfection." The stones pulsed once, and then it began. And then it began. One by one, they placed their stones into the glyph circle at their feet. Brennet's voice began to rise, not in volume, but in resonance. He spoke a version of the realm where peace came through control, where the people were calm because they never needed to remember. "Why burden them with sorrow?" he asked. "Why drag old pain forward?" Alaric stepped in. "Because without sorrow, we forget how we survived it." He knelt and touched the circle, and the vault began to hum. Not just with words, but with stories. Faces flickered on the walls, real faces. a mother clutching her child during the siege of Lorne, a boy running messages across fire-scarred bridges, a blind elder teaching her neighbors how to tell true coins from counterfeit. None of it grand, all of it true. Brunette's illusion cracked. He pushed harder. My truth is cleaner, simpler. It leaves no room for contradiction. But that, Sarah finally said, was the flaw. Real memory is messy, she whispered, but it's alive. The vault shimmered, not with magic, but with weight, the weight of 1,000 unforgotten voices, and it rejected Brunette's echo. The stone in Brenet's hand shattered, not violently, just ceased to be. His breath caught. The walls did not echo him, because his truth, though polished, had no root. Alaric stepped forward and pressed his hand to the heart ring. He didn't speak a speech, he simply said, "I remember." And the stones sang, not one voice, but many, all at once. A chorus of memories layered and bright, full of sorrow and laughter and the stubborn dignity of people who had endured. It was not clean, but it was whole. Outside in the valley, the sky turned orange, and people heard the vault hum, not as sound, but as knowing. Children looked up, elders wept, and somewhere in a ruined village far from the capital, a girl said softly, "He did it." Inside, Brunette turned away. He didn't fight, he didn't argue, he just left. And the vault did not stop him. Because in the end, truth does not need vengeance, it only needs to be heard. Alaric emerged at the twilight, his cloak dusted with stone. The people waited. He said nothing. He only raised his hand, and the valley glowed with lanterns, lit not for victory, but for memory. That night, the realm did not sleep. It remembered. And for the first time in 100 years, morning arrived not with fanfare, but with gentle stillness. In the valley of Murin, dew clung to blades of grass like silver secrets, and the air held the freshness of something beginning, something long buried now stirred and breathing. Alaric stood on the ridge just above the echo vault, cloak swept behind him by a soft breeze. From that height he could see the crowd below, villagers, scholars, farmers, old warriors, and children. Some still held lanterns from the night before, though their flames had long flickered out, but no one moved to leave. They had come not just to witness a confrontation, but to belong to a turning point. Beside him, Tomas approached quietly, a fresh parchment in hand. "Reports are coming in from across the realm," he said, eyes scanning the writing. After the vault rejected Brunette's echo, something changed. Alaric glanced at him. "What changed?" Tomas looked up. People started telling the truth, publicly, in the streets, in taverns, even in temples. Alaric allowed a smile, as if truth were contagious. Darian, just behind them, added with a tired laugh, "Maybe it is. Maybe it always was." Elsewhere in the realm, something quiet but unstoppable had begun. In the village of Trenswick, a blacksmith stood before the town circle and confessed that during the famine 10 years prior, he had hoarded grain. He apologized. No one punished him. But 3 other villagers stood and offered their own truths. Small betrayals, forgotten shames, hidden kindnesses. Each confession met not with scorn, but with shared silence. The village council decided to start a weekly echo evening where no laws were made, no disputes settled, but stories were told. True ones, even painful ones. In Kaelmore, where Lord Heron once ruled with harsh discipline, something unexpected happened. A group of his own guards, inspired by the events in Murin, laid down their swords and offered to serve not as enforcers, but as rememberers. They began to document first-hand accounts from families torn apart by the old regime. Soon those records were taught in schools, not as condemnation, but as caution. Even in Grey Hollow, where Brunette had vanished into self-imposed exile, a shift was felt. The servants spoke less of fear, more of emptiness. Without his vision pressing down on them, the halls felt strangely hollow. A few of the younger scribes began carving passages of old truths into the stone walls. Poems, quotes, personal names of the fallen. No one erased them. Back in Dareth, the capital was changing. The circle of witness, once just a symbolic ring of lanterns, now operated as a forum. Citizens proposed initiatives, farmers brought weather data, Historians debated respectfully with traveling bards. No one controlled the flame in the center. It rose and dimmed in response to harmony or discord, like a living barometer of civic unity. Alaric had removed his crown from public display. It now sat in a glass case in the central archive next to the first ledger of common voices gathered during the crisis. When a child asked him why he didn't wear it anymore, he said, "Because the people remember better than gold ever could." But not all was peace. In the far north, remnants of Brennet's triad still plotted, not overtly, but in the margins. They whispered to those who feared too much truth. They offered illusion again, this time disguised as nostalgia. "We were stronger before," they'd say. "Things were simpler, clearer." In taverns and border towns, those words took root. Simplicity was seductive. Certainty, even false, was a comfort. Tomas was the first to notice the pattern in letters intercepted from northern scouts. Certain phrases repeated. The one story, return to the single flame, echo no more. Darian convened a council immediately. "We cannot outlaw these messages," he said, "or we become the very thing we resist, but we must respond." And so a new initiative began. Echo keepers, ordinary citizens trained to spot narrative manipulation, to offer counter-memory, and most importantly, to listen. Not to argue, not to silence, but to hear and then gently remind. Memory, after all, wasn't a weapon. It was a net, woven strong enough to catch even those falling back into shadows. Sarah traveled alone again, this time not to hunt lies, but to nurture truth. In a mountain village untouched by war, she sat with a group of children and taught them the names of people who had once stood for something. "Who was Andrin the Quiet?" she asked. A girl raised her hand. "The baker who saved 20 soldiers with bread hidden in stones." Sarah nodded. "Yes, and what do we say when we remember?" The children chorused. "We carry them forward." It was not a pledge, it was a rhythm. Weeks later, as the land began to turn toward winter, Alaric returned once more to the Echo Vault, not to speak, but to listen. The stones hummed faintly. He sat on the floor alone and pressed his palm to the glyph. The vault did not speak in voices anymore. It spoke in moments, the breath of a dying man forgiving his enemy, the laughter of two children rebuilding a broken bridge with pebbles and twine, the silence of a mother holding her son's name in her heart, though he had vanished years ago. All of it flowed through him. And for the first time in many years, Alaric wept, not in sorrow, but in awe, because what they had built was not a nation. It was a memory that breathes. On the night of the solstice, a new flame was lit in every town, every hill village, every port. It wasn't called a festival. It had no name. It didn't need one. People gathered, held hands, and said one sentence aloud, "I remember." Some added names, others told stories. A few said nothing, but stayed, and that was enough, because remembering was no longer a burden. It was a bond. In his private chamber, Alaric wrote one final line into the royal ledger before closing it gently. "May they forget my name, but never what we remembered together." Then he blew out the candle and let the darkness hold the light for once. In the weeks that followed the solstice, the kingdom seemed to move with a gentler rhythm. No edicts, no declarations, and yet something had shifted across every corner of the realm. People no longer waited for orders from above. They simply acted, from memory, from understanding, from something deeply human that no longer needed to be dictated. Alaric had stepped back from daily affairs, allowing the council and the newly formed Echo Keepers to guide policy and discourse. But his presence was still felt, in the same way a hearth continues to warm even after the fire is low. He spent his mornings in the archives, cataloging stories and mapping memory threads, and his afternoons walking the streets, often in plain clothes, speaking with bakers, children, travelers, and once even a former rebel captain who now ran a public bathhouse. There was no ceremony to these encounters, just conversation, just shared breath. And one question he always asked, "What is the one truth you hope no one ever forgets?" The answers varied. My daughter's laugh the day we made it out of the city, the taste of oranges before the drought, the last words my brother said when he chose to stay behind and open the gate. Each response was recorded in a small leather-bound notebook Alaric kept with him. No titles, no names, just truths. He called it the Quiet Chronicle. In the western province of Renal, something unexpected bloomed. A community theater troupe had begun performing reenactments of stories collected from the Hearthroots. But instead of dramatizing war or kings, they chose everyday legends. The time an old man rescued a dog from floodwaters, or when three rival merchants collaborated to build a school during a winter freeze. These stories spread not because they were spectacular, but because they felt like home. Children reenacted them in alleyways. Teachers encouraged students to write their own memory plays. Even taverns offered discounts if patrons could tell a true story they hadn't yet shared. It wasn't history in books, it was history becoming habit. But not all was settled. In the southern cliffs of Elenra, a group calling themselves the Shroud began spreading veiled messages. Painted on stones, whispered in market stalls, etched into wood. Truth is just one version too loud. They didn't attack. They didn't rally armies. They simply doubted, and in doubt they planted fear. Who decides which memories matter? Isn't forgetting a kind of mercy? What if silence is the only honest voice? At first, these questions stirred only the edges of conversation, but over time, they reached the center. A council was called. Scholars, memory keepers, echo keepers, and ordinary citizens gathered under the Lantern Dome in Dareth. For 3 days, they debated. Was there danger in too much memory? Could shared history become burden? Was forgetting always a flaw? Sarah, who had remained largely silent throughout, finally stood on the final evening. Memory is not about control, she said. It's about connection. We don't remember to punish. We remember to understand. She walked to the center of the hall and placed a single item on the ground, a small, cracked cup. This belonged to my brother, she said. I almost threw it away, because remembering hurt. But now, when I hold it, I don't feel pain. I feel continuity. She turned slowly. Forget if you must, but don't forget why you remembered in the first place. There was no vote, but the silence after her words held more weight than any tally. As spring approached, a new custom began to emerge. Each town held a woven day, during which families contributed one item, an object, a story, a song, to a community tapestry or archive. These were not grand declarations. Sometimes it was a single word, sometimes a melody hummed without lyrics, sometimes just a color painted on cloth. These tapestries hung not in museums, but in bakeries, inns, granaries, and crossroads shelters, places where people paused. No one explained them. They didn't need explanation. They just were. One morning, Alaric visited the village of Ven, far in the north. He had no formal reason to go, just a letter from a boy named Haim who had written, "We have a story, but no one to hear it. Would you?" Alaric arrived alone. The boy met him at the edge of the field with 3 others, his sister, his grandmother, and an old man with no teeth but eyes that smiled like moons. They led him to a tree. Under it was a box, inside dozens of stones, each with a single word carved. Not names, not dates, just words. Promise, rain, shatter, carry, mend. The grandmother explained. Each stone marked a story too hard to say aloud, but too real to throw away. Alaric asked if he could add one. He chose a blank stone and carved, "Begin." When he placed it in the box, he felt something close around him. Not hands, not vines, but recognition. He had not ruled from above. He had sat beside. That night, under the same tree, the villagers built a fire. No speeches, just warmth. Haim asked, "Will you come back?" Alaric smiled. "If I do, what will you tell me?" The boy thought for a moment. A new word. That was enough. When Alaric returned to the capital, the Lantern Dome was quieter than usual. He passed through its halls, noting the chalk markings left by children, the weather notes scribbled by traveling bards, and the open book of questions anyone could write in. What makes a memory worth keeping? Can 2 people remember the same moment differently and both be right? What happens when the last person who remembers something is gone? Alaric added his own entry. Maybe we don't preserve truth. Maybe truth preserves us. Back in his chamber, he looked at the crown still encased in glass. He didn't feel pride. He didn't feel distance. He simply felt belonging in a realm where memory was not perfection, but presence, where stories weren't carved in stone, but carried in skin, and the kingdom was not built of laws alone, but of listening. The season turned gently, and with it the kingdom settled into something neither entirely new nor entirely old, a living balance where memory and action walked hand in hand. People no longer looked solely to Dareth for guidance. They looked to one another. It was not a world of certainty, but it was a world of care. And perhaps that was better. In a sunlit garden behind the Lantern Dome, Alaric met with an old friend, Nira, once the head of the Royal Scriptorium, now retired and tending to a small library near the river. She brought tea and a folded letter. "It's from Brennet," she said simply. Alaric opened it in silence. The handwriting was unmistakably his, precise, deliberate. "I've gone to the borderlands, not to vanish, but to watch. You were right about memory. But I'm still not certain it forgives. Perhaps it never will. But if it teaches, that may be enough. I will not return to the vault, but I will write. If stories are what we leave behind, then I owe a few." Alaric folded the letter and said nothing. Nira stirred her tea. "Do you hate him?" He shook his head. "No, I remember him. That was all." News came soon after that the town of Farron, long thought lost to the war, had rebuilt its central tower not in stone but in memory. They called it the Listening Spire, and every citizen contributed a voice. Not just noble deeds or victories, but failures, regrets, and reconciliations. The tower did not echo with sound, it stored resonance. A person could stand within and hear snippets from across the realm. Lullabies sung after loss, arguments resolved, laughter shared across distance. It became a pilgrimage site, not for absolution, but for understanding. Meanwhile, Tomas returned from a 6-month journey along the southern coast, where he had helped establish new memory circles in port cities, places once too transient for record-keeping, now humming with storytellers, traveling scribes, and echo singers who memorized the collective truths of entire harbors. He brought Alaric a shell etched with 12 names and a single phrase, "All hands remembered." Alaric placed it beside his window. Sarah, too, had traveled far. She had spent time among the mountain tribes, people who had never bowed to a central king, but had long held their own traditions of remembrance. In return for their stories, she shared songs from the vault. Some were old lullabies. Others were new compositions made entirely from quotes spoken during the Great Gathering. The tribes were not easily impressed, but when she sang the story of the cracked cup, they grew quiet. The eldest among them, a woman with hair like woven frost, placed her hand on Sarah's heart and said, "Now you carry the silence with music. That is how echoes live." As spring slipped into early summer, the capital prepared for the festival of First Light, an old holiday once used to celebrate royal heirs, now reshaped to honor beginnings of all kinds. Births, marriages, apprenticeships, reconciliations, any moment that marked the turning of one's path. Alaric stood on the dais but made no speech. Instead, he lit a single lantern, placed it on the river, and watched it float away. All around him, others did the same. No fireworks, just water and flame and gentle wishes carried by current. That night, in a quiet study lined with tapestries, Darian approached Alaric with a question. "We've done what we set out to do," he said. "The realm remembers. The vault is whole. The people are listening. But what now?" Alaric looked at the wall, where a simple map of the kingdom had been drawn, its borders no longer marked by political lines, but by circles of story, of resonance, of connection. "We don't rule," Alaric said. "We remind. That's the future." Darian paused. "And you? What will you become?" There was no answer right away. Then, softly, "I'll become someone worth remembering, but not for titles, for truths kept." In the days that followed, Alaric began preparing for a quiet departure, not a retreat, not abdication, just movement. He packed light, his chronicle, the etched shell, a small carved emblem from the mountain tribes, a ring from Tomas for protection, and Sarah's latest song inscribed on parchment. He left no letter, no final decree, just one line scratched into the stone lintel of his study. Memory is not mine to hold, it belongs to those who carry it forward. Word of his leaving spread slowly, like mist rolling over fields. No panic followed, only soft questions. Did he leave alone? Will he return? Where did he go? The answer was always the same, where stories still need to be heard. Some believed he went east to the forgotten coast. Others said he walked north to help the villages still caught in shadow. A few claimed he now lived as a nameless traveler, gathering stories in exchange for bread and song. No one knew, and yet everyone felt him. In every campfire where an elder whispered a tale, in every lantern circle lit on a rainy night, in every child who looked at an old cup and asked, "What happened here?" And so the kingdom endured, not through conquest, not through monuments, but through presence. Every market became a memory archive, every path a possible echo, every silence an invitation. And those who remembered Alaric didn't speak of power or rule or even the vault. They spoke of a man who listened, of someone who let others speak first, and of a world that slowly, steadily learned how to speak to itself again. One evening, in the outskirts of a town unnamed on most maps, like a girl sat with an old man beneath an open sky. She held a small stone in her hand, undecorated. "What do I put on it?" she asked. The old man smiled. "Whatever you don't want the world to lose." She thought for a moment, then carved a single word. "Still." The old man looked at her, then at the sky. And somewhere in the wind that stirred the grass, a familiar echo passed through. Not loud, not insistent, just present. And in that moment, the realm remembered again. The moon rose over the hills of Analith, casting a soft silver sheen over a meadow where no markers stood. No statues, no banners, no declarations. Yet this field had become sacred in its own way. Not by royal decree, but by quiet tradition. Once a year, on the longest day, people came here not to be seen, but to listen. They brought stories. They brought silence. They brought each other. This year, the gathering was larger. Farmers from distant valleys, children from mountain villages, even two elders who had once served under Brené and now traveled together, carrying journals filled with letters never sent. Among the crowd moved a woman with a low hood, a travel-worn coat, and a stringed instrument slung across her back. It was Sarah. She found a spot near the middle and sat with ease, nodding at those around her. When the sun touched its highest point, she stood, not because someone asked her to, but because the moment called her, and without introduction she began to play. No lyrics this time, just melody. A song woven from fragments of memory collected over years, snatches of lullabies, echoes of farewell, the rhythm of a hammer striking stone in sorrow and in hope. The meadow grew still. Then, one by one, voices joined her, soft, untrained, imperfect, but true. Not rehearsed, not planned, only remembered. In a town near the eastern shore, a boy named Talon sat beside his grandmother, reading from a book passed down through 3 generations. It was not famous. It held no royal seal, but its pages were filled with inked stories, ones people had once been afraid to tell. Now, Talon read them aloud in the town square every 7th evening. Not for profit, not even for applause, but because he believed memory grew stronger when spoken aloud. When asked where he learned that, he said, "A man once told me that stories don't live in books, they live in voices." No one knew who the man was, but they all nodded as if they did. In the far west, on a wind-lashed cliff where old towers had long since crumbled, stood a new structure. Not built from stone, but from woven reeds and bonewood, carried piece by piece from every region of the realm. It was called the Hollow Archive, not because it was empty, but because it was open. Anyone could enter, anyone could leave something behind. A sentence, a symbol, a song. Children scrawled their dreams on clay tablets and tucked them in the walls. Travelers left tokens, feathers, buttons, bits of string. Elders left names, always just one. The archive did not catalog, it welcomed, it held, and when the wind passed through, it sang, not in words, but in the hush of memory, stretching its wings. Meanwhile, deep within the heart of the forest once feared and avoided, a single lantern burned. It was not part of a ceremony. There was no crowd, only an old man sitting by its side, scribbling into a weathered book. Alaric, his beard now gray, shoulders more stooped than they once were, but eyes still alive with that same quiet fire. He had chosen this place not for isolation, but for listening. For years now, people had found their way to him, one or two at a time, not seeking answers, but space, permission to speak, to wonder, to be heard without interruption. He never wrote their names unless they asked, but he recorded their truths. And sometimes when a tale was finished, he would hand them a stone and say, "Write the word that remains." They never asked what that meant. They simply did it. Some cried, some smiled, all left lighter. The book in his lap, now on its 12th volume, had no title on the cover, but inside on the first page it read, "Not a record," not a warning, just the sound a soul makes when it is no longer afraid. One afternoon, Thomas arrived. He was older now, his back not quite as straight, but his eyes just as sharp. He brought no guards, no entourage, just 2 cups and a bundle of dried fruit. They sat beneath the trees, no ceremony, no proclamations, just 2 friends, watching the wind stir leaves above them. "I thought it was time," Thomas said, "to finish what we started." Alaric smiled. "Didn't we already?" Thomas shook his head. "We began something, but I think it's you who will finish it." Alaric looked out at the path that twisted beyond the clearing. He had no map. He didn't need one. In Dareth, on the 100th year of the realm's renewal, a new monument was unveiled. But it was not built of stone. It was a simple table, carved from old timber, placed beneath an open sky. Around it were chairs, none taller than the other. In the center sat a flame that never went out, kept alive by the hands of volunteers who rotated in silence, hour by hour, day after day. No plaque told who started it, no guards protected it, but people came to sit, to listen, to speak, and to remember. A girl once asked her father, "Why is there no name on the monument?" He answered, "Because the story isn't done yet." In the end, no one truly knew where Alaric died, or even if he did. His body was never found. No grave was marked. But travelers sometimes claimed they saw him, an old man at a market in the north, whittling wood beside a fire in the east, or watching children play near a mountain spring in the south. Most said it was just myth. But those who had met him once, they always paused before dismissing it, because something in them whispered, "It could be." And that was enough. One day, a child sat down at the listening spire and placed a hand on the stone. She didn't say anything. She just listened. And then she whispered, "Still here." The walls echoed softly, and the story, once more, continued. And now, dear listener, we've reached the final whisper of tonight's journey. If you've stayed with us this far, I want to thank you, not just for listening, but for feeling your way through every word, every silence, every flicker of memory that passed between us. These stories live because someone like you holds space for them. And now, I'd love to know, what stayed with you the most? Was there a moment, a sentence, a character that echoed something inside you? Leave a comment below and tell me, your reflections help shape the next stories we tell. And if this gentle kind of storytelling speaks to your soul, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's the best way to support this small corner of the internet where slowness is sacred, silence is respected, and stories are shared like warm tea on a rainy evening. Wherever you're listening from, whatever time it is, thank you for making space for stories like this. Now, turn down the screen, let the quiet in, and sleep well. I'll see you in the next tale. Until then, stay soft, stay curious, and keep listening.